At dawn, the wall seems to rise out of the mountains as though the mountains themselves have grown teeth. Grey stone climbs a ridge near Beijing, breaks over a summit, falls into a saddle, then rises again into cold blue haze. The towers are square and silent. Wind pushes through the arrow slits. Below, the valleys are still dark, and on the parapet the worn bricks hold the faint warmth of millions of hands that have touched them in wonder. It is the image the world knows. A single colossal barrier, drawn across northern China by one commanding will, a continuous line so immense that it has become less a ruin than an idea. But stand there long enough, looking beyond the restored masonry and the postcard angles, and the first certainty begins to loosen. The wall vanishes behind the hills. It does not tell the eye where it ends, what it joins, or whether what lies beyond even resembles the stone beneath one's feet. That uncertainty is the opening to the real story. Because the Great Wall is not one wall, not one construction project, not even one age speaking with one voice. It is an enormous, scattered archive written in brick, stone, packed earth, gravel, reeds, trenches, gates, watchtowers, and abandoned lines across landscapes so different that some sections appear to belong to entirely different worlds. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the first mystery of the Great Wall is also its most persistent misunderstanding. Most people have seen only its final, most photogenic face. The rugged battlements north of Beijing, the steep stairways, the brick towers marching across pine-covered mountains, belong largely to the Ming Dynasty, whose rulers governed China from 1368 to 1644. This is the wall that survived best. The wall later travellers described, the wall restored for visitors, photographed from the air, reproduced in films, advertisements, school books, and souvenir shops. It is real, magnificent, and historically vital. Yet it is only one layer of something far older and far less neat. Long before those brick parapets were laid, frontier walls already crossed plains and mountain gaps, long after individual sections lost their military purpose. Their ruins continued to be reused, eroded, farmed over, or absorbed into villages. In many places, the Great Wall does not look grand at all. It is a low scar across dry ground, a weathered ridge of tamped earth, a line of pale mounds diminishing into desert, or a watchtower standing alone where the wall connecting it has almost vanished. This changes the scale of the object. A wall is easy to imagine it begins somewhere, runs in a line, and ends somewhere else. The Great Wall is harder. It consists of overlapping defensive systems, built, expanded, repaired, neglected, and sometimes superseded across more than 2,000 years. Sections run parallel to one another. Some turn away from what a modern visitor might expect to be the border. Some protected routes through deserts. Some defended farmland. Some guarded mountain approaches and river crossings. Others mark spaces where soldiers could observe movement, transmit alarms, regulate passage, or try to make an uncertain frontier legible to an anxious court far away. A wall alone cannot explain such a system. It is closer to a chain of landscapes shaped by state power forts and signal towers, garrison settlements and supply roads, passes that narrowed traffic into controllable points, ditches and embankments that may now barely rise above the surrounding soil. The total length associated with the surviving Great Wall system is often given as more than 20,000 kilometres, a figure so large it almost defeats imagination. But even that number requires care. It does not describe one unbroken rampart curving elegantly across a map. It gathers together walls from different eras, branching lines, trenches, natural defensive features, fortifications, and related remains. The number is not a trick. It recognises that the Great Wall is the name given to an immense historical system, rather than a single surviving structure. A traveller could spend a lifetime visiting its fragments, and still move between completely different forms of building. In the humid, dramatic mountains near Beijing, stone and brick cling to knife-edge ridges. Far to the west, where wind scrapes across gravel plains and desert margins, ancient barriers may be made from local earth and layers of reeds, their edges softened by centuries of sand. Further north, across regions once contested by different regimes, defensive lines recall rulers who do not fit comfortably into a simple story of settled China, defending itself against outsiders. The wall was built by rival states, unified empires, fractured dynasties, and regimes founded by peoples whose own origins lay beyond older frontier lines. There is something unsettling in that realization. A famous wall is usually offered as a symbol of permanence, a nation in stone, a boundary made visible, a civilization holding firm against the open north. Yet much of the Great Wall is made not of permanent stone, but of earth. It is fragile. Rain can open it. Wind can reduce it. Crops, roads, mining, building work, and simple neglect can erase it. Even the surviving brick stretches are not untouched relics frozen in their original form. Many prominent sections have been repaired or reconstructed in modern times. This does not make them false. It makes them part of a continuing history of how people choose to remember the past. Still, the contrast matters. The wall presented to the world is solid, serrated, heroic. The wider wall system is often broken, uncertain, and disappearing. Its most revealing portions may be the least dramatic to look at eroded earth ridges, where the material itself exposes what the monument really was. An attempt repeated again and again to impose order upon spaces where order was always temporary. Imagine leaving the crowded passes near the capital and moving westward, away from familiar masonry. Roads thin out, mountains open into broader horizons, the air grows drier, the wall no longer demands attention with towers and crenellations. Sometimes it must be searched for. A slight rise runs beside a track. A rectangular mound interrupts a flat plain. A line of earth, almost the colour of the land around it, catches the low sun at an angle and suddenly becomes visible. In those quiet remains, a different great wall emerges, one without the comfort of spectacle. Men once stood here watching empty distance, trying to distinguish dust raised by animals from dust raised by riders. Messages once moved from beacon to beacon, not across a perfectly sealed border, but across an exposed frontier where news mattered because distance was dangerous. Supplies had to arrive, water had to be found, horses had to survive. A fortified line that appears imposing on a map could become nearly useless if its garrisons were hungry, isolated, unpaid, or unsure whether an approaching group was enemy, trader, envoy, ally, or all of these at different moments. The wall's Chinese name, Changcheng, means the long wall, and the phrase captures something more accurate than the single monumental object imagined abroad. Long walls existed before Imperial China. Long walls were recalled, rebuilt, and transformed after each political order changed. The later expression of a wall stretching 10,000 LO was never merely a surveyor's measurement. It conveyed vastness, endurance, and the almost mythic reach of imperial concern. Yet names can gather separate things into one memory. A defensive barrier built by one state against another before China was unified might later be folded into the larger story. An earthen frontier line left by a late dynasty could be viewed as another part of the same inheritance. Over time, history compresses complexity. Separate walls become the wall, different fears become a single fear of invasion, different builders become a vast anonymous labour force. Different failures and successes become one deceptively simple question: did the Great Wall work? That question will matter, but not yet, because before a structure can be judged, it has to be seen clearly. The Great Wall was never simply a locked gate between two worlds. People crossed it legally and secretly. Goods passed through its gates. Armies stationed along it depended on exchanges with the very lands they were meant to watch. Rulers who ordered walls also negotiated, sent gifts, made alliances, traded horses, accepted defectors, encouraged markets, and at times launched campaigns far beyond their defences. On both sides of any frontier lived communities whose interests did not always match the neat categories later histories assigned to them. Agriculture and pastoral life met, overlapped, and clashed. Political centres rose and weakened. Drought, severe winters, the needs of herds, the ambitions of generals, and disputes at court could turn a quiet border into a corridor of violence. The wall belonged to that unstable world. It was not a simple refusal to engage with it, but one costly way of trying to manage it. Even the notion of a northern threat needs to be handled carefully. The lands beyond various walls were not empty wastes inhabited by faceless raiders waiting to descend on fields and cities. They held mobile societies, trade networks, confederations, rival leaders, families, rituals, ambitions, and economies finely adapted to grassland and desert-edge environments. At different times, some northern powers could overwhelm imperial armies. At other times, Chinese dynasties pushed deeply into frontier regions or controlled them through alliances and garrisons. Walls do not divide civilization from absence. They reveal where competing political systems encountered each other, where officials felt exposed, and where rulers attempted to turn movement into something that could be watched and managed. The surviving stone and earth therefore preserve not a clean separation, but the evidence of contact. That is one reason the wall is so often misunderstood. Its physical presence is overwhelming. Standing on it, the mind wants a clear explanation equal to its size. It seems to say that there must have been one decision, one enemy, one astonishing act of construction. But large monuments often hide the most complicated histories. The pyramids compress generations of labour and belief into geometric certainty. Roman roads conceal repairs, detours, military calculations, and local compromises beneath their straight surviving stones. The Great Wall does something similar on a continental scale. It persuades the eye that it is unified even when the ground says otherwise. Scholars still debate details of early routes, dates, purposes, and the relationship between surviving remains and written accounts, because the oldest evidence is incomplete, and many earthworks have eroded almost beyond recognition. What survives in the record suggests not an uninterrupted master plan, but repeated responses to repeated insecurity. There is also a quieter human truth buried in this landscape. Any wall this long invites legends of suffering, and later stories would remember labourers dying far from home, families separated, bodies imagined within the ramparts themselves. The truth of those specific tales requires care and evidence, but the hardship does not need invention. To raise defensive works through mountains, deserts, and remote frontier zones demanded labour, transport, discipline, food, timber, stone or earth, and people compelled or commanded to remain where life could be brutally difficult. The grand image of the wall cannot be separated from those unseen lives. Yet even here, the first lesson remains: there was no single workforce building a single wall in a single imperial moment. There were generations separated by centuries, responding to new rulers, new threats, new technologies, and new ideas of what a frontier should be. As sunlight strengthens over the restored battlements near Beijing, the wall begins to fill with colour and movement. Visitors climb the steps, pausing at the towers to look outward, each person briefly inhabiting the familiar vision of a mighty barrier running endlessly across the horizon. It is a beautiful vision, but the truth is larger. Far beyond sight lie collapsed earthen lines older than the bricks underfoot. Frontier stations swallowed by sand. Fortresses guarding routes that no longer carry armies, and parallel walls raised because an earlier answer was no longer enough. The Great Wall is not diminished by giving up the myth of a single unbroken monument. It becomes stranger, more human, and far more revealing. Its beginnings do not lie with one emperor commanding a miraculous line into existence. They lie in an earlier age, when there was no unified China at all, and rival states began carving their anxieties into the earth. Long before stone battlements climbed the mountains north of Beijing, long before an emperor could claim to rule all under heaven from a single throne, walls already cut across the Chinese landscape. They did not face one direction. They did not belong to one people. They were not yet the defiant edge of a unified empire looking outward into the grasslands. Some of the earliest long walls stood between states that shared rituals, writing traditions, farming worlds, and ambitions, yet regarded one another with the suspicion of enemies. In those centuries, the land later called China is not a single country defending itself. It is a political arena crowded with rival courts, competing armies, fortified cities, shifting alliances, and rulers determined not merely to survive, but to swallow their neighbours before they are swallowed themselves. The first walls associated with the future Great Wall rise from this world of division. And that fact turns the familiar story inside out. The wall does not begin as a boundary between China and everyone beyond it. It begins as evidence that China itself has not yet been made. The setting is the long decline of Zhou royal authority. For generations, kings of the Zhou dynasty possessed the prestige of ancient ritual rule, but less and less of its practical power. Beneath them, regional states grow stronger, wealthier, more organised and more independent. During the spring and autumn period, beginning in the 8th century BCE, rulers compete through diplomacy, marriage, ritual status, raids, and campaigns. By the age later remembered as the Warring States period, the struggle has hardened. The great states no longer behave like unruly members of one loose aristocratic family. They behave like governments preparing for total survival. They register households, tax harvests, recruit large infantry armies, appoint administrators, dig canals, cast weapons in greater numbers, and fortify their vulnerable lines. War expands from the limited contest of noble chariots into something broader, harsher, and more demanding battles involving masses of troops, fortified positions, siegecraft, and the control of land and population. In such a world, a long defensive wall is not an eccentric monument. It is a rational answer to a terrifying question. How does a state defend fields, roads, cities, and frontier districts when its enemies can return season after season? The answers are first made from what the earth provides. The early long walls are not the high grey brick ramparts that later dominate the imagination. Much of their strength lies in tamped soil. Builders place earth between wooden frames and pound it in compacted layers, adding gravel, local stone, or other material where terrain and resources allow. Once compressed and dried, rammed earth can be formidable. It needs no distant quarry and no long caravans of fired bricks. It can rise from the ground it is meant to defend. On hills, it follows ridges and narrow approaches. Across valleys and plains, it restricts movement or channels an advancing force toward guarded points. A damaged wall can be repaired with local labour and local earth, provided officials possess enough authority to gather both. Yet it is also a material vulnerable to time. Once garrisons disappear and repairs cease, wind, rain, farming, and human reuse slowly flatten what was once imposing. That is why the oldest long walls can be so difficult to identify with certainty. A written record may remember one route, an eroded line in the hills may suggest another. Scholars still debate the precise dating and sequence of some of these early systems because the evidence remains incomplete, and later memory often simplified a far more complicated landscape. Among the strongest candidates for one of the earliest major long walls is the Wall of Qi, in what is now largely Shandong. Qi is not a remote northern outpost staring into steppe emptiness. It is an affluent eastern state, shaped by fertile agricultural districts, access to coastal resources, salt and trade, and an increasingly capable administration. Its great defensive barrier extends across southern approaches, using mountains and ridgelines to protect Qi from rival powers, especially the threatening world of states to its south and west. Here the wall is unmistakably an internal barrier within the wider Chinese cultural and political sphere. It is not built to separate farmers from nomads. It is built because a powerful state fears other powerful states. The oldest references to the Qilong Wall are difficult to pin to a single moment of construction. An archaeological study suggests phases of building and reinforcement rather than one dramatic beginning. That may seem less satisfying than a founding legend, but it is more revealing. Fortifications usually grow where pressure repeatedly returns. A ruler raises part of a barrier, a successor extends it, another strengthens a weak passage or adds troops and posts. Over time, a line of local decisions becomes something vast enough to enter history. The state of Chu presents another early and equally important case. Chu dominates wide territories in the south, viewed by its rivals with a mixture of fear, fascination, and condescension. It develops its own political identity and cultural splendour, yet competes intensely within the same brutal contest for supremacy. Defensive works traditionally associated with Chu are sometimes described as among the earliest long walls. Although their relationship to later Great Wall traditions is not simple, they guarded strategic zones against neighbouring states, particularly where routes and terrain created vulnerable corridors. In the later imagination, it is tempting to draw a clean line from these early ramparts to the mighty northern frontier walls of empire. But the real connection is more subtle. Qi and Chu reveal that building long barriers was already a known political technology before unification, a way of marking defended territory, securing agricultural wealth, controlling movement, and buying warning time against organised armies. The idea of the Long Wall was not invented in response to a single northern enemy. It was born from many directions of danger. Further west and north, the character of the problem begins to shift. The states of Qin, Zhao, and Yan occupy territories where conflicts with neighbouring Chinese states intersect with encounters and wars involving mobile pastoral peoples and frontier groups. Here, landscapes widen toward uplands, steppe margins, and corridors through which riders, livestock, traders, diplomats, fugitives, and raiding parties can move with unsettling speed. To courts dependent on taxed farmland and fixed settlements, mounted forces crossing open country present a difficult challenge. A raid may strike before a large infantry force gathers, livestock can be taken, villages damaged, and confidence in the ruler's protection shaken. Defensive walls and garrisons do not prevent every crossing, but they can slow movement, mark watchable routes, shelter troops, and provide lines from which states attempt to hold new territory. Zhao offers a vivid example of how fast the old world is changing. In the 4th century BCE, King Wuling of Zhao is remembered for adopting cavalry methods and clothing associated with northern mounted fighters, a reform famous precisely because it acknowledges that a state cannot defend itself merely by dismissing the practices of its rivals. Zhao must learn from the frontier even as it fortifies parts of it. This is a crucial detail, easily lost beneath later images of a wall dividing two sealed civilizations. The early walls arise alongside borrowing, trade, recruitment, negotiation, and adaptation. A state facing mobile northern forces may build barriers, but it may also adopt horses, riding techniques, weapons, and tactical ideas from the same wider world. Frontier history is never simply a tale of keeping others out. It is also the story of becoming changed through contact. Yan, in the northeast, faces a different expanse. Its reach moves toward the regions of present-day Hebei and Liaoning and beyond, where its defensive lines and military colonies reflect both ambition and insecurity. Written traditions credit Yan commanders with campaigns that push frontier peoples back and create new defences across conquered or exposed territory. What survives archaeologically and what survives in historical texts do not always fit perfectly, and caution is necessary. Later, historians often organised earlier events into clearer narratives than the ground can fully confirm. Yet the broad pattern is credible. Northern and northeastern states did not only protect old cores, they expanded, occupied, settled, and then tried to retain what they had seized. A wall in such a context is not only a shield, it can be the hard edge of advance, a structure built after armies move outward, intended to hold land newly brought under control. That contradiction lies at the heart of the Great Wall from its earliest ancestry. Walls appear defensive, and often they are. A family whose fields lie behind one may experience it as protection. A soldier standing on an embankment against an approaching raid may have no doubt about its purpose, but for communities displaced, absorbed, taxed, or watched after a conquering state extends its reach, the same wall may represent aggression made permanent. It can say the army has arrived. Officials will follow, and this line will now determine who passes freely and who is treated as a threat. The wall does not simply freeze a natural border already waiting in the landscape. It helps manufacture frontiers. It turns hills, rivers, fields, and grazing zones into political claims, even when those claims remain contested. Within the Central Plains, the walls between rival states express another fear: the speed with which one state's strength can become another state's ruin. The warring states era does not reward weakness. Land means grain. Grain feeds soldiers. Soldiers take more land. Defensive barriers protect more than capitals. They help guard cultivated districts, passes, transport routes, and positions necessary for campaigns. Behind a wall may lie villages planting millet and wheat, households producing cloth, officials counting stores, workshops repairing weapons, and roads carrying carts of provisions toward an army. The grand strategies of rulers depend on these ordinary systems remaining intact. An enemy that penetrates a vulnerable corridor can threaten far more than one fort. It can interrupt harvests, seize population, frighten allies, and expose a state's heartland. Walls become one element in a larger transformation: the conversion of society into resources for sustained war. They also change the experience of the landscape. A ridge that once offered a broad view now supports an earthen barrier. A mountain pass becomes a guarded throat. Farmers working nearby see military patrols and labour parties. Travellers encounter checkpoints and regulations. Communities living on the wrong side of a new defensive work may find familiar movement altered by politics decided far away. Construction itself demands extraordinary effort. Soil must be excavated, carried, watered when needed, compacted again and again. Timber is required for frames and supporting structures. Towers or forts must be placed where watch and communication make sense. Troops must be fed after the builders depart, or the most impressive rampart becomes only an abandoned mound. No single explanation fully accounts for every early wall, because each state confronts its own geography and rivals. But all of them reveal rulers developing a sharper ability to mobilize labour and transform terrain into strategy. The name Great Wall, applied across centuries, can make these early structures appear as fragments of an inevitable future, as though they are waiting for an emperor to arrive and connect them into destiny. The people building them cannot know that future. A labourer compacting earth for Qi does not imagine a Ming watchtower outside Beijing more than 1,000 years later. A Zhao official worrying over a frontier outpost does not know that later generations will fold his state's defences into the image of one national monument. For him, there is no united empire to preserve. There is only Zhao, surrounded by risk. For Qi, there is Qi. For Chu, Chu. For Yan and Qin, the wall protects claims that may vanish within generations. Their barriers are monuments to political fragmentation. Built by states trying to survive long enough to become the one power no longer requiring walls against its rivals. One of them succeeds. Qin, positioned in the west, develops a ruthless administrative and military strength that allows it to overpower the other great states one by one. Its rise will eventually transform every earlier wall. Barriers separating conquered kingdoms become unwanted reminders of division, while northern defences become assets for an empire suddenly confronted with the scale of its outer frontier. Yet before that transformation, the most important truth remains visible in the packed earth lines of the pre-imperial age. The Great Wall's ancestors were not born from isolation. They were born from competition, expansion, fear, adaptation, and the terrible creativity of states at war. The familiar wall across the northern mountains begins here, in a divided landscape where every ruler studies the horizon and understands that Earth itself can be turned into a weapon. When the last rival kingdom falls, the old landscape of walls does not disappear, it changes meaning almost overnight. In 221 BCE, Qin conquers the final independent states, and its king assumes a title without precedent. First emperor, Qin Shi Huang, fortified lines once built to hold back Qi, Zhao, Yanchu, and the others now run through territory claimed by a single ruler. Some have become obstacles inside an empire that wishes to move officials, grain, soldiers, prisoners, and decrees without remembering old borders. The northern lines, however, point toward a problem conquest has not removed. Beyond the fields and commanderies of the newly unified realm, mounted confederations are growing more dangerous. The emperor who has broken the walls between kingdoms turns toward the walls facing outward, and here later memory fixes upon one of history's most enduring images labourers driven into the north, raising an immense barrier under an emperor whose ambition seems as limitless as his fear. The image contains truth, but not the simple truth repeated so often. Qin Shi Huang does not create the Great Wall from nothing, nor does he command one uninterrupted stone rampart like the restored Ming Wall familiar today. His empire inherits existing northern defences built by Qin Zhao and Yan during the Warring States era. What it does is repair, join, extend, and reorganise parts of those systems within a larger military frontier. The materials are those of the terrain and of the age. Compacted earth, gravel, stone where available, forts, watch positions, roads, and garrison settlements. Many stretches have vanished or are difficult to trace. The main written account comes from historians writing after Qin has collapsed, preserving essential information but viewing the dynasty through the shadow of its fall. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the broad outline is clear. The First Imperial Wall is not a civilization suddenly sealing itself away. It is an urgent military response by a conquering regime that has unified one war zone only to confront another. During the late Warring States period, groups referred to in Chinese records as the Xiongnu are becoming increasingly significant across the northern frontier. Their history and early formation are difficult to reconstruct from outside descriptions alone. The surviving accounts were written largely by the states that fought or negotiated with them. They should not be imagined as a shapeless horde appearing from empty grasslands. They belong to a complex mobile world of herding, exchange, warfare, shifting leadership, and far-reaching connections. Horses, livestock, seasonal movement, and mounted speed give northern forces advantages that a newly unified agrarian empire cannot ignore. Military success in the Central Plains does not automatically secure every northern district. A raid can strike settlements or herds and retreat before heavy forces answer. A frontier distant from the imperial capital can suddenly become a test of whether unification truly means protection. Around 215 BCE, Qin sends the general Mengtian north with a vast army, traditionally recorded as numbering 300,000 men. Exact ancient troop totals deserve caution, because historical accounts frequently magnify the scale of major campaigns, but the operation is unmistakably large. Mengtian attacks the Xiongnu, drives Qin control into territories around the Ordos Loop of the Yellow River, and establishes or restores frontier defences. This landscape matters. The Yellow River bends in a broad arc through the north, enclosing grassland and semi-arid zones that can serve as a strategic buffer. To hold it is to push danger away from agricultural heartlands and gain forward positions against northern attack. But holding it is harder than winning it. Armies can advance in a season, administration must remain afterward. Fortifications, roads, supply depots, garrisons, and lines of communication attempt to make conquest endure. The wall associated with Qin is therefore not merely a barricade thrown across the path of riders. It is part of an effort to occupy and organise a frontier. Troops need warning when hostile forces approach, Commanders need places from which to patrol, gather men, and signal danger. Grain and equipment need routes northward, often over harsh distances. Settlers and officials may follow military gains, extending imperial presence into contested zones. Qin is famous for standardization. Systems of writing, weights, measures, axle lengths, administration, law, and roads all reflect a government determined to make conquered territory answer to one centre. The northern works belong to the same imperial instinct. Earth is not only piled into ramparts, space itself has been classified, guarded, connected, and compelled to obey. From the court's perspective, such measures may seem like the necessary cost of securing a fragile new order. From the viewpoint of the people made to carry that cost, they can feel like a disaster without end. Qin government is able to command labour and military service on a scale earlier rival states had developed, but unification makes that reach vast. Men are sent to frontier campaigns, woolworks, roads, canals, imperial palaces, and the enormous funerary complex of the first emperor. Convicts and conscripted labourers are especially associated with harsh construction projects, and ordinary households face levies, separation, taxation, and the possibility that those sent away will not return. Building in the north means cold winters, dry winds, poor supplies, exhausting transport, disease, and the vulnerability of men working far from home. A rammed earth wall demands endless repetition, soil moved, framed, pounded dense, raised layer by layer, connected with defensive posts and supported by provisions dragged over long roads. Later generations remember Qin not as the patient founder of a peaceful order, but as a dynasty of overwhelming power and unbearable demands. Its rule lasts only a brief time after the first emperor's death in 210 BCE. Rebellion erupts in 209 BCE, and within a few years the empire he created has fallen into violence and replacement. In the aftermath, Qin's building works become inseparable from moral judgment. The wall stands in historical memory beside burned books. Punished scholars in traditional accounts, vast palaces, the mausoleum guarded by terracotta soldiers, labour battalions, military expeditions, and a legal order remembered as pitiless. Not every later accusation can be accepted literally. Historians under the succeeding Han Dynasty had reasons to describe Qin excess as a lesson in how not to rule. Yet Qin's rapid fall suggests that coercion, heavy burdens, and political fragility were not merely inventions of its critics. A state can mobilise immense numbers through fear and discipline, but it may also exhaust the obedience on which it depends. No story captures this emotional truth more strongly than the legend of Meng Jiangnu, the woman whose husband is taken away to work on the wall. In the best-known later form, she travels through hardship to find him, learns that he has died, and weeps so intensely that a section of the Great Wall collapses, revealing his bones among the dead. It is one of China's most famous folk narratives, a story of grief powerful enough to break imperial stone. But it is not a reliable report from the reign of Qin Shi Huang. Earlier versions of a faithful widow's mourning story are not originally set at the Great Wall, and over centuries the tale changes and becomes attached to Qin construction and imperial cruelty. There is no archaeological basis for the widespread claim that wall sections were routinely built with labourers' bodies sealed inside them as construction material. Death on such projects was entirely plausible, but the popular image of skeletons deliberately mixed into the wall belongs to legend rather than established evidence. And yet dismissing the legend as false misses why it endured. A society does not need documentary proof of one named woman's tears to understand what state labour can take from a family. The legend reduces continental ambition to a single absence, a husband gone north, a household waiting, a wife discovering that an emperor's monument has consumed the life around which her own was built. Official histories tend to remember walls as strategic decisions and generals as instruments of policy. Folk memory asks who paid for them. The dead leave fewer records than the ruler who sent them. What survives in the records suggests a frontier project inseparable from military pressure, state coercion, and genuine human loss, even when later storytelling reshapes details into drama. There is a further irony in Qin's wall building. The dynasty is later imagined as turning China inward behind a permanent barrier, but Qin itself is aggressively outward moving. Meng Tian's campaigns are not the behaviour of a government hiding behind defences. The regime attacks, advances, seizes territory, creates commanderies, and places defences farther north because it seeks to control a larger world. Nor does the wall create peace in the years surrounding Qin's collapse. The Xiongnu themselves consolidate under the powerful leader Modu, whose confederation becomes one of the great military forces of Inner Asia. Qin's wall has not settled the frontier for all time. It has marked one phase in a contest whose balance can alter with astonishing speed. When imperial attention fractures amid rebellion, the frontier becomes vulnerable again. The new Han rulers will inherit the northern dilemma, along with defences that cannot operate without armies, food, horses, command, and political resolve. Even the linking of older state walls contains a contradiction. Unification allows Qin to treat the northern frontier as one strategic concern rather than the problem of separate competing kingdoms. But those inherited walls were designed for conditions that no longer exist exactly as before. A wall built by Zhao or Yan reflects old boundaries, old routes, old calculations. Qin can repair and connect portions, but an empire requires different priorities. Some interior barriers lose purpose because they divide conquered lands that must now be governed as one. In the north, selected lines are folded into a new system. That process is less like drawing a single line across a blank map than like taking fragments of many former worlds and forcing them into imperial service. The Great Wall, even at its most famous founding moment, is already an act of reuse. For centuries afterward, the first emperor will dominate the popular origins of the Wall because his reign offers everything memory clings to: ambition, conquest, cruelty, spectacle, rapid collapse, and the haunting possibility that works meant to secure eternity can instead expose the limits of power. The Great Wall becomes attached to his name so tightly that older walls fade behind him, and later walls are often mistaken for his creation. The truth is more complicated and more unsettling. Qin Shi Huang does not build the stone dragon seen by modern travellers. He commands a vast northern frontier effort built largely of earth, extending and reshaping older defences amid military expansion. Its scale is extraordinary, its costs severe, and its promise uncertain. The emperor can order a wall raised across the northern horizon, but he cannot command history to remain on his side. After Qin falls, the earthworks remain where the wind and dust allow them to remain. The empire is gone, its ruler sealed within his massive tomb complex, its commands silenced, its successors already remaking the political world. But the problem that drove men northward under Meng Tian has not vanished. It is stronger now, organised under formidable Xiongnu power beyond the frontier, facing a new dynasty still recovering from civil war. The Han will look upon the northern distances and discover that a wall inherited from conquest is only the beginning. To survive, they will have to decide whether to defend, bargain, trade, attack, expand, or attempt all of these at once across a frontier stretching farther west than Qin's rulers could fully control. The guard who watches the western horizon from an earthen tower is not looking at a border in the modern sense. He is looking at movement. Dust lifting from a track may mean a patrol returning, merchants approaching an oasis, herders shifting animals toward water, an embassy carrying seals and gifts, fugitives escaping one ruler for another, or mounted men arriving with violence in mind. The wall behind him gives his post a shape and a duty. But it does not divide the world into two fixed halves. Beyond it are not lands forever outside imperial influence. Behind it are not lands forever secure. The frontier breathes. It narrows and widens with the strength of armies, the confidence of rulers, the loyalty of local communities, the availability of grain, the condition of grasslands, and the harsh arithmetic of distance. A line of fortifications may claim permanence, but the world around it remains alive, mobile, and unwilling to stay where an official map says it belongs. This is one of the deepest truths hidden by the familiar image of the Great Wall. A wall looks final. It implies that a decision has been made, this side is protected, that side is foreign, this side is order, that side is danger. Along the actual northern frontier, almost nothing is so stable. Some years bring relative quiet, regulated trade, envoys crossing guarded passes, gifts exchanged between courts, soldiers growing vegetables near their posts, and communities on either side depending upon one another more than official language admits. Other years bring failed harvests, political assassinations, raids, punitive expeditions, defecting commanders, shattered alliances, and watchtowers suddenly lighting the darkness with alarms. A frontier line can remain physically in the same place while its meaning changes entirely. In one generation, it is a heavily guarded military edge. In another, it is bypassed, neglected, or left behind as control moves outward or collapses inward. The environment itself helps make the frontier uncertain. Northern China does not end in a simple edge where cultivated fields suddenly meet endless grass. The transition is broad, uneven, and constantly sensitive to rainfall, temperature, water supply, soil, and human use. There are river valleys and dry steppe margins, mountain passes and sandy lands, pockets of agriculture beside regions better suited to grazing, areas where farming can spread during favourable periods and retreat when drought or warfare makes it impossible to maintain. The Ordos region within the Great Bend of the Yellow River is especially revealing. It can offer strategic depth, pasture, and routes of movement, but it can also be difficult to hold. A dynasty that controls it may push its defensive concern farther north. A dynasty that loses strength may find hostile forces operating much closer to settled districts. The wall does not simply stand against nature. It is caught inside landscapes whose productivity and vulnerability help decide whether military plans succeed. Climate cannot be treated as a single hidden switch causing every migration or war. Human decisions, rival leaderships, markets, family survival, imperial policies, and military ambitions all matter, yet periods of drought, extreme cold, disrupted pasture, or pressure on herds can sharpen conflict in regions where mobility is essential to life. When animals weaken or grazing becomes contested, groups may seek new access to resources, raid settled zones, negotiate for grain and textiles, or attach themselves to strong confederations. At the same time, agrarian states are not protected from environmental strain. Floods, droughts, locusts, failed harvests, and tax burdens can weaken garrisons and leave frontier communities unable to support expensive defences. A court may command vigilance, but a hungry soldier at a neglected post cannot be sustained by proclamations. What survives in the record suggests that the frontier often became most dangerous, not because one side suddenly discovered aggression, but because several systems of survival were under pressure at once. Movement across this zone is not always invasion. Pastoral communities require access to pasture, water, animals, exchange networks, and political protection. Farmers and soldiers in frontier districts need horses, livestock products, tools, salt, and sometimes peaceful relations with neighbours whose knowledge of the local landscape is invaluable. Markets therefore matter as much as fortifications. At designated places and under varying degrees of supervision, agricultural goods, silk, grain, tea in later periods, metal objects, animals, hides, and horses pass between worlds that official rhetoric may portray as enemies. The horse is especially important. Empires whose military strength depends heavily on infantry and taxed grain repeatedly need high-quality mounts from regions beyond their easy control. Northern powers, meanwhile, may desire grain, cloth, crafted goods, luxury items, or politically useful recognition from imperial courts. The frontier is dangerous precisely because it is valuable. People struggle over it because they also need what moves through it. This creates a contradiction no wall can eliminate. A ruler may wish to restrict raiders while admitting traders, to reject threatening armies while welcoming envoys, to keep frontier commanders loyal while allowing them enough local flexibility to manage complicated relationships, to acquire horses without empowering the groups who supply them, to settle farmers in exposed lands without provoking endless conflict over grazing and water. Gates and passes become places of judgment rather than simple closure. Documents checked, tribute missions received, markets authorized or forbidden, refugees interrogated, scouts dispatched, animals counted, and rumours weighed against the possibility of attack. Smuggling naturally flourishes wherever official policy restricts things people still want. Even during moments of official hostility, local exchanges may continue quietly, because survival at the edge of empires rarely obeys the purity demanded in a distant capital. Nor are the people beyond the wall politically united. The term used by imperial historians for a northern confederation may give the impression of one permanent opponent, but confederations rise through leadership, alliances, marriage ties, military success, distribution of wealth, and the ability to command followers. They can split. Rival claimants can seek support from Chinese courts. Groups can submit, rebel, migrate, or serve as allies against other groups. Imperial rulers repeatedly try to use these divisions, offering titles, gifts, trade access, settlement, or military partnership to some while campaigning against others. Northern leaders employ diplomacy just as strategically, alternately pressing for favourable exchange, threatening frontier districts, cultivating defectors, or exploiting imperial disorder. The wall stands in the middle of these negotiations, useful for warning and defence, but never capable of simplifying the political world beyond it. The Han experience makes this especially clear. After years of expansion and warfare, relations with the Xiongnu are not resolved by one final victory. Over time, the Xiongnu political world experiences division, and Han rulers find opportunities to accept submissions, make alliances, station forces, and exert influence through diplomacy as well as war. At certain moments, groups once feared as enemies become buffers or partners against other northern forces. At other moments, imperial reach weakens and the old dangers return in altered form. A tower built against one threat can later watch for another. A route opened for armies can carry marriage envoys, tribute parties, refugees, or traders. The frontier system is durable not because it has one unchanged purpose, but because it can be adapted to circumstances that continually escape prediction. Behind the wall, identity itself is less fixed than later stories sometimes imply. Frontier districts contain soldiers transferred from distant regions, convicted men sent into service, farming households moved to support garrisons, local populations drawn into imperial administration, merchants pursuing profit, and people whose families have long histories of contact across the northern zone. Some inhabitants speak different languages or live by mixed livelihoods. Some farm and herd. Some trade with communities whom officials classify as outsiders. Some serve a dynasty until another power takes control of their district, after which survival may require accommodation with new rulers. To people in the capital, the frontier can appear as a clear edge of civilization. To people living there, it is home a complicated, dangerous, practical world in which one learns which road is safe, which officer accepts bribes, which market is reopened, which season brings riders south, and which promise from far away is unlikely to be kept. The wall also shapes migration by trying to manage it. When an empire expands, it may settle populations along newly controlled territory, creating farming colonies, military communities, or administrative centres intended to make distant control permanent. When control fails, those settlers may flee, be captured, remain under new authority, or disappear into local populations whose histories are poorly recorded. Conversely, individuals and groups from beyond imperial lines may cross inward seeking trade, protection, land, reward, or escape from rivals. Courts sometimes welcome them, settle them, recruit their fighting skills, or use them as proof of imperial prestige. At other moments, such communities become objects of suspicion, blamed for unrest or treated as potential collaborators. The wall marks concern about movement while also documenting how impossible it is to stop people from moving when war, hunger, opportunity or fear pushes them onward. Popular imagination often turns the Great Wall into a monument of isolation, as though its builders wished to sever China from the rest of Eurasia. The historical frontier tells almost the opposite story. Fortifications become necessary partly because contact is constant. Horses, weapons, customs, technologies, military practices, luxury goods, religious ideas, artistic influences, diplomatic knowledge, and human communities move across and around defensive lines over centuries. The Han expansion westward does not close the empire, it draws it into more distant relationships. The wall near the corridors and passes serves a world in which exchange is too valuable to abandon and danger too real to ignore. It is a structure of controlled openness, attempting to decide which forms of movement will be permitted and which will be punished. The effort is never complete. Even a successful wall may shift violence rather than end it. Riders blocked at one guarded route can seek another passage, strike less defended settlements, exploit corrupt officials, or wait until a dynasty is distracted elsewhere. An empire that makes one region secure may simply push the zone of conflict farther outward, requiring new forts, new garrisons, longer supply lines, and greater expense. Victory extends responsibility. Expansion creates more frontier, not less. The cycle appears again and again. A ruler sees danger at the edge of settled lands, sends troops to drive it back, constructs lines to preserve the gain, establishes officials and farms to support those lines, then discovers that the newly held territory must itself be defended against threats beyond it. A wall that seems to end uncertainty can become proof of how far uncertainty has travelled. There are moments when a dynasty chooses a different balance, paying for peace, opening trade, arranging marriage alliances, accepting a shared frontier, or relying more heavily on mobile forces and diplomacy than on large construction. Such policies are sometimes judged harshly by later writers who admire aggressive expansion or monumental defence. Yet walls are not automatically signs of strength, and negotiation is not automatically evidence of weakness. Building and maintaining frontier systems can drain a state that has overestimated its capacity. Refusing trade can encourage raiding or strengthen hostile alliances. A treaty that seems humiliating in official memory may protect communities from devastation. A military victory celebrated in court histories may leave villages ruined, cavalry destroyed, and treasury stores empty. No single explanation fully accounts for the choices rulers make. Because they are always deciding under imperfect information, balancing honour, security, cost, and the unpredictable intentions of others. By the end of the Han world, centuries of conflict, diplomacy, expansion, retreat, and settlement have left the northern landscape threaded with walls, whose importance rises and falls with the powers around them. Some continue to guard strategic passages, some deteriorate while command shifts elsewhere. Some remain visible as claims the state can no longer fully enforce. Political unity itself begins to fracture, and with fracture comes a harder question than the Han founders faced. What happens to a frontier wall when there is no longer one undisputed empire behind it? In the centuries ahead, regimes born from both settled and mobile traditions will rule parts of northern China, confront rivals, rebuild old defences, create new ones, and challenge any simple division between who belongs inside the wall and who remains outside. The Long Wall has already ceased to be the possession of one dynasty. Soon it will become the inheritance of many competing worlds, each trying. Once again, to persuade the shifting frontier to hold still, the new dynasty inherits a frontier already filled with ghosts. Behind it lie the ruins of Qin ambition, rebellion, civil war, and the exhausted lands from which the Han rulers must rebuild an empire. Ahead lies a northern power that has not been broken by Qin campaigns or earthworks. The Xiongnu Confederation under Modu has grown stronger in the confusion, commanding mounted forces across vast grassland territories and pressing against the northern approaches of the Han realm. In 200 BCE, the founder of the Han dynasty, Emperor Gaozu, marches north against them and discovers with brutal clarity how little victory in the heartland guarantees on the frontier. At Baideng, near present-day Datong, his forces are surrounded for days by Xiongnu cavalry. The emperor escapes, but the lesson is unmistakable. The new dynasty cannot simply repeat Qin's confidence and assume that walls and armies will force the north into submission. At first, survival demands compromise. The policy that follows is remembered as Hikin, a system of negotiated peace often involving marriage alliances, gifts, grain, silk, wine, and other goods sent to Xiongnu rulers in exchange for a measure of frontier stability. Later Chinese history sometimes described this arrangement with embarrassment, as though the empire is purchasing safety from an enemy it ought to have defeated. But the early Han court is not choosing between pride and cowardice. It is governing a country still recovering from catastrophic warfare, with limited resources and an opponent capable of moving faster than its armies can reliably answer. A peace that holds imperfectly can be preferable to a war the dynasty is not yet prepared to win. Even so, raids continue, negotiations strain, and each exchange reminds the court that the frontier remains beyond full control. The old Qin works stand in parts of the north. But a wall without strategic advantage is merely an obstacle in an enormous landscape. Over the following decades, Han power deepens, agriculture recovers, revenue grows, court politics shift, horses, troops, weapons, and grain can be gathered on a scale that earlier rulers lacked. By the reign of Emperor Wu, who comes to the throne in 141 BCE, caution increasingly gives way to expansion. Emperor Wu is ambitious, energetic, and willing to spend lives and wealth to push Han influence outward. Beginning in the late 2nd century BCE, his generals launch immense campaigns against the Xiongnu. Among the most famous are Wei Qing and Huo Kubing, commanders whose victories carry Han forces into northern and northwestern regions once dominated by their enemies. Huo Kubing, still extraordinarily young when he leads major cavalry operations, strikes into the Hexi region and helps break Xiongnu control there. His career is brilliant and brief. He He dies in his early 20s, leaving behind the memory of a military prodigy whose successes reshaped the map. That map matters because the Hexi Corridor is not merely another distant frontier district. It is a long, narrow passage between formidable natural barriers, the high mountains and plateaus to the south, the harsh deserts and open dry lands to the north. Through it runs a route toward the far west, through what is now Gansu and toward the oasis regions beyond. Control of this corridor gives the Han more than defensive depth. It separates the Xiongnu from potential allies and resources farther west, opens access to horses and diplomatic partners in Central Asia, and creates a protected line through which troops, messengers, merchants, envoys, animals, grain, and intelligence can move. When Han forces secure the Hexi Corridor, the wall ceases to be merely a northern shield. It begins to stretch outward as the skeleton of a far-reaching imperial project. Fortifications move with that project. The Han extend defensive lines westward, establish commanderies such as Wuwei, Jianghe, Juquan, and Dunhuang, and place garrisons and beacon towers across terrain where distance itself can be an enemy. Here, the Great Wall looks very different from the later brick ramparts in the mountains near Beijing. In the arid northwest, builders use materials close at hand, tamped earth, gravel, reeds, brushwood, bundles of plant matter, and layers of sand compressed into remarkably durable barriers. In places, the dry climate preserves these humble materials for 2,000 years. A visitor expecting stone grandeur might find instead an eroded wall with reeds still visible in its body, brittle organic lines embedded between layers of earth. That survival is one of the wall's most surprising truths. The Western Han frontier was not made monumental by expensive stone alone. It was made functional by people who understood how to turn desert plants, packed soil, and local gravel into defences capable of enduring longer than the empire that ordered them built. The wall through the northwest is never simply a raised line. It belongs to a system of observation and response. Watchtowers stand within signalling distance of one another, positioned so that a warning can travel across otherwise overwhelming spaces. Smoke by day and fire by night are among the most familiar signals, but frontier communication could be more organised than a lone flame against the sky. Different alarm methods might indicate different conditions or numbers of approaching enemies. Flags, drums, torches, and prepared fuel all play roles within military communication traditions. Garrisons observe roads, water sources, passes, and open approaches. At certain stations, officials keep records, register movements, issue supplies, receive documents, and monitor the fragile chain connecting the Western territories back to the imperial centre. A frontier defence line is only as effective as the speed with which information moves along it. The wall does not have to physically halt every rider if its towers can warn the next post, summon troops, shelter supplies, or prevent surprise. The remains near Dunhuang make this world especially vivid. Here, at the edge of cultivated oases and desert horizons, the Han frontier approaches gates whose names will become charged with memory: the Jade Gate, or Yumen Pass, and farther south the Yang Pass. Beyond them lie routes into the Tarim Basin and onward through Central Asia. Later imagination often gathers these roads beneath the romantic name Silk Road, as though silk caravans simply flowed westward along a peaceful trade highway. The historical reality is more dangerous and more interesting. These are branching networks of travel through deserts, mountains, oases, states, and contested zones, carrying not only silk but horses, jade, glass, metals, plants, beliefs, rumours, envoys, captives, and military intelligence. Trade and empire do not travel separately. The Han desire access to western regions partly because strategic pressure from the Xiongnu makes alliances and horses matters of survival. What later generations celebrate as cultural exchange is entangled from the beginning with warfare, diplomacy, fortification, and the effort to secure routes through perilous country. The court's interest in the West intensifies after the mission of Zhang Qian, an envoy sent during Emperor Wu's reign to seek an alliance against the Xiongnu. Captured early in his journey, he spends years among the Xiongnu before escaping and continuing west, eventually returning to Han territory after an extraordinary absence. His mission does not produce the alliance originally hoped for, but it gives the court information about distant states, routes, goods, and political possibilities previously known only vaguely. His accounts help widen the empire's horizon. Beyond the Xiongnu are other powers, other markets, other horse-breeding regions, and other opportunities for influence. For Han strategists, Far West no longer looks like an abstract edge of the world. It becomes a field of policy. The walls and garrisons advancing through the Hexi Corridor are the material answer to that newly enlarged vision. But vision is easier at court than endurance on the frontier. To hold the western line requires a continuous burden of labour and supply. Soldiers stationed in arid regions cannot live on military courage. They need grain, clothing, weapons, animals, fuel, water, repair materials, and relief from isolation. Transporting provisions over great distances is enormously expensive, and the farther the frontier stretches, the more the empire must find ways to sustain men close to where they serve. Military agricultural colonies, often associated with the practice of tuntian, enable troops and settlers to cultivate land near garrisons where irrigation and local conditions allow. Around oases and river-fed ground, the frontier becomes not only a chain of walls, but a human settlement system. Farms support posts protect fields and routes, administrative stations bind local survival to imperial policy. A wall across a desert is impressive, but a field of grain grown beside a fortified outpost may be just as important to the survival of the frontier. Among the dry remains of the Han Northwest, archaeologists have uncovered written traces of that daily machinery. Wooden and bamboo slips survive where the desert protected them from decay, preserving fragments of official communications, lists, accounts, legal matters, supplies, guard duties, and movements through frontier stations. At places such as Yuanquan, near Dunhuang, the record does not speak in the grand language of imperial destiny. It reveals travellers lodged and provisioned, horses accounted for, documents passed onward, envoys received, minor officials managing the immense practical burden of a road through the frontier. The Empire is present not only in victories carved into history, but in tallies, rations, schedules, and instructions scratched onto narrow wooden slips. These small objects are a useful correction to the heroic view. Walls may be raised by commands from emperors, but frontiers survive by clerks, guards, farmers, stable workers, messengers, labourers, and weary officers making sure tomorrow's provisions arrive. This western expansion comes at tremendous cost. Emperor Wu's campaigns win important victories and establish Han influence far beyond what early rulers could have maintained, but long wars consume treasury, animals, manpower, and patience. Armies lose men not only in battle but to distance, weather, hunger, thirst, illness, and exhaustion. Horses, essential to fighting mounted opponents over vast spaces, are difficult and costly to replace. Frontier expansion enriches the state with strategic opportunities, while also creating new obligations that can never simply be ignored. Every fort captured must be held or surrendered. Every route opened must be defended or allowed to become dangerous again. Every ally cultivated may demand gifts, protection, or intervention. No single wall solves these problems. The wall makes expansion visible. It does not make expansion easy. Nor does Han's success erase the Xiongnu or permanently secure the northern world. The balance of power changes across decades. Factions divide, alliances shift, campaigns weaken one side or the other, and some groups submit while others resist or move. At moments the Han exert remarkable reach, at other moments the costs of that reach press heavily upon the dynasty. Scholars still debate the exact functions and chronology of some surviving Han frontier lines. Because a barrier in the desert may serve several purposes across its life, warning against attack. Policing roads, marking secured territory, protecting agricultural colonies, regulating movement, or supporting communications between military stations. It is tempting to call all of this a border wall, but the word border suggests a certainty the frontier seldom possessed. The Han line is at once a defence, a corridor, a claim, and a gamble. As evening settles over the desert west of Dunhuang, the surviving ramparts do not resemble an empire in triumph. The wall is low now, roughened by time, its reeds exposed where the outer layers have broken away. A beacon tower rises against the fading sky, not elegant, not invulnerable, but stubbornly present. 2,000 years ago, a guard standing near such a tower might have looked east toward the next station, and west toward a road disappearing through gravel and dust. Somewhere beyond the horizon rode envoys carrying gifts, merchants leading animals, patrols searching for movement, soldiers approaching a posting they might never leave, and enemies whose intentions no wall could make entirely predictable. Behind him lay an imperial world of fields and cities. Ahead lay territories the Han desired, feared, traded with, and tried to understand. The Great Wall had travelled far beyond the shadow of Qin. It now guarded not only against attack, but the routes through which an empire reached into the unknown, discovering with every mile that a frontier is never a fixed line for long. The guard who watches the western horizon from an earthen tower is not looking at a border in the modern sense. He is looking at movement. Dust lifting from a track may mean a patrol returning, merchants approaching an oasis, herders shifting animals toward water, an embassy carrying seals and gifts, fugitives escaping one ruler for another, or mounted men arriving with violence in mind. The wall behind him gives his post a shape and a duty, but it does not divide the world into two fixed halves. Beyond it are not lands forever outside imperial influence, behind it are not lands forever secure. The frontier breathes. It narrows and widens with the strength of armies, the confidence of rulers, the loyalty of local communities, the availability of grain, the condition of grasslands, and the harsh arithmetic of distance. A line of fortifications may claim permanence, but the world around it remains alive, mobile, and unwilling to stay where an official map says it belongs. This is one of the deepest truths hidden by the familiar image of the Great Wall. A wall looks final. It implies that a decision has been made, this side is protected. That side is foreign, this side is order, that side is danger. Along the actual northern frontier, almost nothing is so stable. Some years bring relative quiet, regulated trade, envoys crossing guarded passes, gifts exchanged between courts, soldiers growing vegetables near their posts, and communities on either side depending upon one another more than official language admits. Other years bring failed harvests, political assassinations, raids, punitive expeditions, defecting commanders, shattered alliances, and watchtowers suddenly lighting the darkness with alarms. A frontier line can remain physically in the same place while its meaning changes entirely. In one generation it is a heavily guarded military edge. In another it is bypassed, neglected, or left behind as control moves outward or collapses inward. The environment itself helps make the frontier uncertain. Northern China does not end in a simple edge where cultivated fields suddenly meet endless grass. The transition is broad, uneven, and constantly sensitive to rainfall, temperature, water supply, soil, and human use. There are river valleys and dry steppe margins, mountain passes and sandy lands, pockets of agriculture beside regions better suited to grazing. Areas where farming can spread during favourable periods and retreat when drought or warfare makes it impossible to maintain. The Ordos region within the Great Bend of the Yellow River is especially revealing. It can offer strategic depth, pasture, and routes of movement, but it can also be difficult to hold. A dynasty that controls it may push its defensive concern farther north. A dynasty that loses strength may find hostile forces operating much closer to settled districts. The wall does not simply stand against nature, it is caught inside landscapes whose productivity and vulnerability help decide whether military plans succeed. Climate cannot be treated as a single hidden switch causing every migration or war. Human decisions, rival leaderships, markets, family survival, imperial policies, and military ambitions all matter, yet periods of drought, extreme cold, disrupted pasture, or pressure on herds can sharpen conflict in regions where mobility is essential to life. When animals weaken or grazing becomes contested, groups may seek new access to resources, raid settled zones, negotiate for grain and textiles, or attach themselves to stronger confederations. At the same time, agrarian states are not protected from environmental strain. Floods, droughts, locusts, failed harvests, and tax burdens can weaken garrisons and leave frontier communities unable to support expensive defences. A court may command vigilance, but a hungry soldier at a neglected post cannot be sustained by proclamations. What survives in the record suggests that the frontier often became most dangerous, not because one side suddenly discovered aggression, but because several systems of survival were under pressure at once. Movement across this zone is not always invasion. Pastoral communities require access to pasture, water, animals, exchange networks, and political protection. Farmers and soldiers in frontier districts need horses, livestock products, tools, salt, and sometimes peaceful relations with neighbours whose knowledge of the local landscape is invaluable. Markets therefore matter as much as fortifications. At designated places and under varying degrees of supervision, agricultural goods, silk, grain. Tea in later periods, metal objects, animals, hides, and horses pass between worlds that official rhetoric may portray as enemies. The horse is especially important. Empires whose military strength depends heavily on infantry and taxed grain repeatedly need high-quality mounts from regions beyond their easy control. Northern powers, meanwhile, may desire grain, cloth, crafted goods, luxury items, or politically useful recognition from imperial courts. The frontier is dangerous precisely because it is valuable. People struggle over it because they also need what moves through it. This creates a contradiction no wall can eliminate. A ruler may wish to restrict raiders while admitting traders, to reject threatening armies while welcoming envoys, to keep frontier commanders loyal while allowing them enough local flexibility to manage complicated relationships, to acquire horses without empowering the groups who supply them, to settle farmers in exposed lands without provoking endless conflict over grazing and water. Gates and passes become places of judgment rather than simple closure. Documents are checked, tribute missions received, markets authorized or forbidden, refugees interrogated, scouts dispatched, animals counted, and rumors weighed against the possibility of attack. Smuggling naturally flourishes wherever official policy restricts things people still want. Even during moments of official hostility, local exchanges may continue quietly, because survival at the edge of empires rarely obeys the purity demanded in a distant capital. Nor are the people beyond the wall politically united. The term used by imperial historians for a northern confederation may give the impression of one permanent opponent, but confederations rise through leadership, alliances, marriage ties, military success, distribution of wealth, and the ability to command followers. They can split. Rival claimants can seek support from Chinese courts, groups can submit, rebel, migrate, or serve as allies against other groups. Imperial rulers repeatedly try to use these divisions, offering titles, gifts, trade access, settlement, or military partnership to some while campaigning against others. Northern leaders employ diplomacy just as strategically, alternately pressing for favourable exchange, threatening frontier districts, cultivating defectors, or exploiting imperial disorder. The wall stands in the middle of these negotiations, useful for warning and defence, but never capable of simplifying the political world beyond it. The Han experience makes this especially clear. After years of expansion and warfare, relations with the Xiongnu are not resolved by one final victory. Over time, the Xiongnu political world experiences division, and Han rulers find opportunities to accept submissions, make alliances, station forces, and exert influence through diplomacy as well as war. At certain moments, groups once feared as enemies become buffers or partners against other northern forces. At other moments, imperial reach weakens and the old dangers return in altered form. A tower built against one threat can later watch for another. A route opened for armies can carry marriage envoys, tribute parties, refugees, or traders. The frontier system is durable not because it has one unchanged purpose, but because it can be adapted to circumstances that continually escape prediction. Behind the wall, identity itself is less fixed than later stories sometimes imply. Frontier districts contain soldiers transferred from distant regions, convicted men sent into service, farming households moved to support garrisons, local populations drawn into imperial administration, merchants pursuing profit, and people whose families have long histories of contact across the northern zone. Some inhabitants speak different languages or live by mixed livelihoods. Some farm and herd. Some trade with communities whom officials classify as outsiders. Some serve a dynasty until another power takes control of their district, after which survival may require accommodation with new rulers. To people in the capital, the frontier can appear as a clear edge of civilization. To people living there, it is home a complicated, dangerous, practical world in which one learns which road is safe, which officer accepts bribes, which market has reopened, which season brings riders south, and which promise from far away is unlikely to be kept. The wall also shapes migration by trying to manage it. When an empire expands, it may settle populations along newly controlled territory, creating farming colonies, military communities, or administrative centres intended to make distant control permanent. When control fails, those settlers may flee, be captured, remain under new authority, or disappear into local populations whose histories are poorly recorded. Conversely, individuals and groups from beyond imperial lines may cross inward seeking trade, protection, land, reward, or escape from rivals. Courts sometimes welcome them, settle them, recruit their fighting skills, or use them as proof of imperial prestige. At other moments, such communities become objects of suspicion, blamed for unrest or treated as potential collaborators. The wall marks concern about movement, while also documenting how impossible it is to stop people from moving when war, hunger, opportunity, or fear pushes them onward. Popular imagination often turns the Great Wall into a monument of isolation, as though its builders wished to sever China from the rest of Eurasia. The historical frontier tells almost the opposite story. Fortifications become necessary partly because contact is constant. Horses, weapons, customs, technologies, military practices, luxury goods, religious ideas, artistic influences, diplomatic knowledge, and human communities move across and around defensive lines over centuries. The Han expansion westward does not close the empire, it draws it into more distant relationships. The wall near the corridors and passes serves a world in which exchange is too valuable to abandon and danger too real to ignore. It is a structure of controlled openness, attempting to decide which forms of movement will be permitted and which will be punished. The effort is never complete. Even a successful wall may shift violence rather than end it. Riders blocked at one guarded route can seek another passage, strike less defended settlements, exploit corrupt officials, or wait until a dynasty is distracted elsewhere. An empire that makes one region secure may simply push the zone of conflict farther outward, requiring new forts, new garrisons, longer supply lines, and greater expense. Victory extends responsibility, expansion creates more frontier, not less. The cycle appears again and again. A ruler sees danger at the edge of settled lands, sends troops to drive it back, constructs lines to preserve the gain, establishes officials and farms to support those lines, then discovers that the newly held territory must itself be defended against threats beyond it. A wall that seems to end uncertainty can become proof of how far uncertainty has travelled. There are moments when a dynasty chooses a different balance, paying for peace, opening trade, arranging marriage alliances, accepting a shared frontier, or relying more heavily on mobile forces and diplomacy than on large construction. Such policies are sometimes judged harshly by later writers who admire aggressive expansion or monumental defence. Yet walls are not automatically signs of strength, and negotiation is not automatically evidence of weakness. Building and maintaining frontier systems can drain a state that has overestimated its capacity. Refusing trade can encourage raiding or strengthen hostile alliances. A treaty that seems humiliating in official memory may protect communities from devastation. A military victory celebrated in court histories may leave villages ruined, cavalry destroyed, and treasury stores empty. No single explanation fully accounts for the choices rulers make. Because they are always deciding under imperfect information, balancing honour, security, cost, and the unpredictable intentions of others. By the end of the Han world, centuries of conflict, diplomacy, expansion, retreat, and settlement have left the northern landscape threaded with walls whose importance rises and falls with the powers around them. Some continue to guard strategic passages, some deteriorate while command shifts elsewhere. Some remain visible as claims the state can no longer fully enforce. Political unity itself begins to fracture, and with fracture comes a harder question than the Han founders faced. What happens to a frontier wall when there is no longer one undisputed empire behind it? In the centuries ahead, regimes born from both settled and mobile traditions will rule parts of northern China, confront rivals, rebuild old defences, create new ones, and challenge any simple division between who belongs inside the wall and who remains outside. The Long Wall has already ceased to be the possession of one dynasty. Soon it will become the inheritance of many competing worlds, each trying, once again, to persuade the shifting frontier to hold still. When the Han order finally breaks apart, the frontier does not wait politely for another unified empire to appear. Garrisons lose support, commanderies become exposed, generals act for themselves, and populations move through a northern world where old categories are rapidly losing their meaning. For centuries after the fall of the Han in 220 CE, northern China becomes a shifting arena of kingdoms, migrations, conquests, settlements, alliances, betrayals, and new ruling houses. Some are founded by elites whose ancestors had lived beyond older imperial frontiers. Some draw strength from mounted traditions once treated by Han officials as foreign dangers. Some take control of Chinese cities, tax agricultural populations, employ Chinese administrators, adopt court rituals, and then find themselves facing new threats from farther north. The Wall, which later memory so often imagines as the permanent separation between China and outsiders, now enters one of the most revealing phases of its existence. It is repaired and extended by rulers whose own histories make that simple division impossible. The centuries immediately after Han collapse are filled with instability. The Jin dynasty briefly reunifies much of the realm, but it cannot hold the north securely. Rebellions, invasions, court conflict, and the rise of competing regimes transform the region. Capitals fall, aristocratic families flee south. Northern plains and frontier districts pass through the hands of different powers, many of them associated with peoples long involved in the borderlands Xiongnu, Xianbei, Ji, Di, Qiang, and others whose identities, alliances, and political histories are more complex than the labels in later chronicles can fully preserve. The old wall systems do not stop these transformations. They are crossed, bypassed, abandoned, occupied, or turned toward new enemies. What had once been described as an outer edge of empire is now surrounded by states whose rulers can stand on either side of earlier barriers and still claim authority over parts of the same northern world. Out of this fragmented landscape, the Northern Wei dynasty rises with particular force. Founded by the Toba branch of the Xianbei, Northern Wei establishes dominance over northern China during the 5th century. Its rulers are not invaders merely encamped beyond a Chinese wall. They become emperors governing great agricultural regions, cities, officials, tax systems, monasteries, armies, and populations of many backgrounds. They transfer their capital, reshape institutions, patronize Buddhism on an extraordinary scale, and attempt to govern a realm containing both steppe-facing military zones and long-settled farming districts. Yet control of northern China does not free them from frontier danger. Beyond them stands the Rouran Confederation, a powerful mobile rival whose cavalry and political reach threaten Northern Wei's northern flank. The former frontier outsiders now require a frontier of their own. In 423, Northern Wei builds a defensive line extending for a vast distance across its northern approaches, broadly following routes connected with older walls. In 446, another major construction effort creates an inner line closer to the dynasty's core regions, involving enormous mobilization of labor. These are not decorative references to earlier imperial traditions. They are practical works raised by rulers confronting raids, campaigns, and the possibility that mounted forces could penetrate toward their political centers. Near the northern capital at Pingcheng, in the region of present-day Datong, defense cannot depend upon walls alone. Northern Wei also organizes fortified military settlements, including the famous 6 frontier garrisons positioned to watch and protect the northern zone. Soldiers and their families live in a harsh landscape where loyalty is expected, supplies matter desperately, and the court's attention can determine whether service is rewarded or forgotten. There is a bitter irony here. The frontier garrisons created to protect Northern Wei eventually become one source of its internal crisis. As the dynasty's court changes, especially after the capital moves southward to Luoyang, and elite life increasingly centers far from the exposed northern districts, some frontier military communities feel neglected and dishonored. Their conditions worsen, their resentment grows. In the early 6th century, rebellions erupt among the garrisons. Helping to shatter Northern Wei authority, the defences built to hold danger at the edge reveal a familiar weakness. Men stationed on a wall are not stones. They have families, rank, hunger, grievances, and memories of promises made by governments that may begin to value them only when disaster arrives. A wall can be carefully positioned against an external enemy, and still become useless when the political structure behind it loses the confidence of those required to defend it. From the division of Northern Wei emerge rival successor states, and once again the pressure of the northern frontier produces great construction. The Northern Qi dynasty, ruling in the east during the 6th century, confronts threats from the steppe, especially the rising power of the Turk, or Göktürk, Kaganatis, while also facing competing regimes within northern China. Beginning in the 550s, Northern Qi carries out wall building on an extraordinary scale. Lines extend across mountains and strategic approaches, from regions in Shaanxi toward passes and eastern zones, incorporating towers, fortified points, and older defensive terrain. Some accounts associate Northern Qi with more than 1,000 kilometers of constructional reinforcement within only a few years. Precise figures from dynastic records demand caution, but there is no doubt that its rulers pour enormous energy into the northern defences. Parts of this Northern Qi legacy are especially important because later builders reuse landscapes already prepared by earlier regimes. A mountain pass guarded by Northern Qi can later become vital to the Ming. An old earthen or stone line can guide a new wall centuries afterward, not because history repeats exactly, but because geography remains stubborn. Armies still seek routes through the same ridges, capitals still fear the openings leading toward them, river crossings, mountain corridors, and approaches to the northern plains continue to matter even as dynasties, languages, military technologies, and enemies change. The wall is therefore cumulative in ways that are easy to miss. Every new dynasty inherits not merely ruins, but decisions made by earlier strategists about where the landscape is most vulnerable. When the Sui dynasty reunifies China at the end of the 6th century, it inherits both that defensive experience and the temptation to use imperial power at overwhelming scale. The Sui is energetic, ambitious, and astonishingly productive. Its rulers reunite north and south after centuries of division, strengthen administration, link regions through enormous transport projects, and construct the grand canal system that will shape the empire long after Sui rule is gone. On the northern frontier, however, the danger remains. Turk power presses against the newly restored imperial order, and Sui emperors respond with military preparation, diplomacy, division of enemies where possible, and repeated wall construction. Under Emperor Wen, defensive works are raised in northern regions in response to Turk threats. Under his son, Emperor Yang, the scale grows even more severe. Large labour forces are mobilised for walls across northern approaches, while the dynasty is simultaneously burdened by monumental building journeys, canal projects, and ruinously expensive campaigns against Goguryeo in the northeast. Official histories later claim enormous human losses connected with Sui projects, figures that may reflect hostile judgment as well as genuine catastrophe. Yet the essential pattern is difficult to deny. The dynasty demands more labour, more military service, more transport, more obedience, and more sacrifice than many communities can endure. The walls meant to defend a reunified empire become part of the burden that helps make that empire unstable. The resemblance to Qin is difficult to avoid. Both Qin and Sui bring long division to an end. Both create systems later dynasties benefit from. Both undertake immense public works and military campaigns. Both collapse with shocking speed under the weight of rebellion and exhaustion. In the moral memory of later historians, the Northern Wall becomes once again an emblem of imperial overreach, a ruler trying to secure his state through labour, so punishing that the state itself begins to break. This does not mean walls cause dynastic collapse by themselves. The Sui fall through a combination of failed wars, political discontent, regional revolt, fiscal strain, and leadership decisions. But frontier building belongs to the larger story of a government convinced it can force landscapes and people to obey indefinitely. The Tang dynasty, rising from the wreckage of Sui, draws a very different lesson. Powerful, outward-looking, and militarily confident. The early Tang does not make massive long wall construction the centre of its northern strategy. When proposals arise to repair or rebuild aging frontier walls against the Turks, Emperor Taizong is remembered as rejecting the logic of repeating Sui burdens for little result. His dynasty places greater trust in mobile armies, capable generals, fortified bases, diplomacy, alliances, and campaigns that carry Tang authority far beyond the lines earlier rulers had struggled to defend. Under Tang power, the northern frontier is not secured by hiding behind a continuous barrier, but by projecting military force and managing a complex political world across Inner Asia. This choice matters because it proves that rulers did not automatically build great walls whenever they possessed the resources to do so. The Tang is among the most formidable empires ever to govern China, yet its strength is not expressed through endless wall construction. For a time, its armies and alliances make older defensive lines seem like remnants of an anxious age. In Tang frontier poetry, ruined walls and empty passes can appear as melancholy images, places of dust, distance, loneliness, and soldiers separated from home. Even in an age when the empire seems expansive and confident, those remains preserve the knowledge that frontier control is temporary. The Tang eventually weakens as rebellion. Regional militarization, court struggles, and changing powers beyond its reach erode its command. Its strategy is not a permanent solution any more than Sui wall building was. It is simply a different answer suited to a different balance of strength. After Tang collapse, the north again belongs to competing regimes whose identities resist the old inside and outside picture. The Khitan-led Liao rule wide northern territories. The Tang at Western Xia establish power in the northwest. The Yuxians rise from the northeast, overthrow Liao authority, establish the Jin dynasty, and take control of northern China, forcing the Chinese Song court southward. These rulers are often described in older narratives as peoples from beyond the wall. Yet they too build and maintain defensive barriers. The Jin in particular construct major wall systems across northern grassland zones, including lines reinforced with ditches, towers, forts, and defensive projections. Their concern is not protecting a Chinese empire from the Yuxians. The Yuxians now rule the northern Chinese empire. Their fear lies farther north, where new mobile powers threaten their own dominion. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Jin officials argue over the cost and value of wall construction. Some warn that labour is exhausting the population, and that wind and sand can damage works almost as quickly as men complete them. Others insist that strong barriers will reduce the number of soldiers required and provide lasting security. It is an argument heard in many ages. Whether a wall saves resources by controlling danger, or consumes resources while offering confidence it cannot deliver. Before long, the rise of the Mongols makes the question terrifyingly immediate. Jin walls may hinder movement, protect particular routes, and complicate campaigns, but they cannot by themselves contain a force strengthened by military skill, political momentum, intelligence, defectors, siege experience, and the weakening of Jin authority. By now, the Long Wall has become something far stranger than a boundary between one fixed civilization and its enemies. Xianbei rulers have built it against the Rouran. Northern Qi rulers have raised it against Turk power. Sui emperors have burdened their people to repair and extend it. Tang rulers have largely chosen to rely on armies and diplomacy instead. Yuqian emperors have constructed northern walls against powers arising beyond their own frontier. The same idea returns under rulers of different origins because the problem is larger than ethnicity or dynasty. Any state governing the agricultural wealth and cities of northern China eventually confronts the exposed distance beyond them. Any ruler attempting to hold that world must choose among walls, soldiers, settlements, treaties, trade, tribute, offensive war, or some unstable combination of them all. The walls remaining from these centuries are often overshadowed by the brick fortifications still to come. Many are earthworks, weathered lines, traces on hills, or archaeological remains less dramatic than the later monuments visited by millions. Yet they carry a truth the famous Ming ramparts alone cannot reveal. The Great Wall is not the artifact of one people forever defending itself against another. It is the recurring answer of vulnerable states, including states founded by those once described as outsiders, to the same haunting problem of rule across an open and restless frontier. Centuries pass, dynasties vanish, and the walls rise again wherever governments begin to fear that the horizon is moving toward them faster than they can control it. The Mongols do not appear at the edge of the northern frontier as one more danger that a dynasty might contain with better watchtowers or a deeper ditch. They arrive as a political and military force capable of breaking the old arrangement entirely. In the early 13th century, under Chinggis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Confederation expands with terrifying speed, defeating rival peoples across the grasslands, striking the Jin dynasty in northern China, taking cities once thought defensible, and eventually drawing much of Eurasia into an imperial system unlike anything earlier wall builders had confronted. Jin fortifications do not simply vanish before Mongol armies. Defensive work still matter locally, passes still matter, resistance still exacts costs. But a wall cannot compensate for a dynasty beset by military pressure, shifting loyalties, strategic isolation. An enemy skilled at combining cavalry warfare with siege operations and the use of surrendered expertise. The Jin fall in 1234, the southern Song endure longer, separated from the northern frontier by rivers, fortified cities, difficult campaigns, and stubborn resistance, but they too are conquered in 1279. For the first time, all China is ruled as part of the vast Mongol imperial world under the Yuan dynasty, and the old question of a northern wall changes shape again. The Yuan rulers do not need to defend the same frontier in the same way as the dynasties they replace. Their political heart and military traditions reach across the steppe. The lands beyond many earlier walls are not simply foreign territory pressing inward. They are connected to the ruling order itself, though not without conflict or rival claims. Older defensive lines remain in the landscape, but enormous new continuous wall building is not the defining security policy of Yuan rule. The empire relies upon mobile military strength, garrisons, relay stations, administrative control, and the difficult management of an immense realm spanning regions that walls once tried to distinguish. The Great Wall, during this period, is not erased from history. It is temporarily deprived of its most urgent purpose by a government whose authority extends across both sides of the older division. Once again, the frontier monument reveals its dependence on politics. A wall is only as central as the strategic world that makes it necessary. That strategic world returns with vengeance when Yuan rule in China weakens. In the 14th century, environmental disasters, flooding, famine, disease, economic strain, factional conflict, and rebellion tear at the dynasty's control. Among the rebel forces that rise in this collapsing order is the movement eventually dominated by Zhu Yuanzhang, a man whose life begins in poverty and catastrophe and ends with an imperial throne. In 1368, he declares the Ming dynasty and takes the title Hongwu Emperor. Ming armies seize the Yuan capital at Dadu, later Beijing, forcing the Mongol court northward into the grassland world. But the defeat of Yuan power in the capital does not destroy Mongol military strength. The rulers driven north continue to claim legitimacy. Mongol groups remain active and dangerous beyond the northern frontier. While Ming forces occupy a newly conquered realm, whose northern defences must be rebuilt after decades in which no wall had separated the ruling empire from its steppe base. At first, the early Ming respond not with the monumental brick wall now identified with their dynasty, but with an assertive strategy inherited in part from the confidence of conquest. The Hongwu Emperor establishes garrisons, fortifies key points, distributes military colonies, and sends campaigns north against Mongol forces. His son, the Yongle Emperor, intensifies that outward posture after seizing the throne in a civil war. Yongle moves the imperial capital from Nanjing to Beijing, bringing the court dramatically closer to the northern frontier. This decision will shape the entire future of Ming defense. Beijing is strategically powerful and symbolically commanding, positioned near routes toward Manchuria, Mongolia, and the northern military zones from which Yongle has built his strength, yet it is also dangerously exposed. The capital stands not deep within protected southern riverlands, but within reach of passes through mountains beyond which mobile forces can gather. Guarding the northern approaches is no longer merely about saving distant provinces from raids. It is about shielding the imperial seat itself. Yongle is not a ruler inclined to crouch behind masonry. Between 1410 and 1424, he personally leads or orders repeated campaigns deep into the northern lands against Mongol opponents. Ming armies march across immense distances with horses, wagons, supplies, artillery, officials, and the logistical confidence of a dynasty that believes initiative can secure the frontier. At the same time, Ming power is organised through networks of garrisons and military commands. Some positioned far beyond the lines later defined by the Great Ming Wall, the empire maintains influence toward the northeast and seeks to keep Mongol forces divided, managing relationships with different groups rather than treating the north as a single enemy bloc. The Ming frontier in this early period resembles a broad military zone, defended by mobile operations and forward outposts as much as by barriers. Walls exist and are repaired in places, but the vast brick-faced ramparts that tourists know have not yet become the dynasty's answer. Then confidence begins to narrow. The costs of ambitious northern warfare are immense, and results are temporary. A campaigning emperor may scatter enemies for a season, or compel submission from particular leaders, but he cannot remain forever on horseback beyond the frontier. Mongol politics are divided, shifting, and resilient. Groups weakened in one decade can recover under capable leadership in another. Ming garrisons placed far outward are expensive to supply and difficult to sustain when political priorities change. After Yongel's death, the court becomes less willing to mount repeated large-scale expeditions into the steppe. The dynasty does not suddenly abandon offensive action, nor does it instantly retreat behind a finished wall. Instead, over generations, it confronts an uncomfortable reality: the frontier it hopes to dominate is wider, costlier, and more changeable than even a powerful agrarian state can easily control. Some of the most painful decisions involve the loss or abandonment of forward defensive positions. In the northeastern frontier, Ming withdrawal from more exposed outposts gradually brings the practical defense line closer to Beijing. In the northwest, the challenge of controlling wide regions against raids, political fragmentation, and supply constraints remains persistent. Every position surrendered reduces one burden, but exposes another. A military zone that once provided depth becomes an approach corridor for future threats. The Ming can strengthen passes and rebuild walls, but defensive concentration carries a risk when the outer screen contracts. Any breakthrough nearer the capital feels more catastrophic. This danger is embodied by the rise of Isan, a powerful Oirat Mongol leader in the mid-15th century. The Mongol world beyond the Ming frontier is not politically unified in a stable sense, but leaders able to command alliances and military force can suddenly transform its relationship with the dynasty. Trade and tribute relations matter intensely. Ming courts attempt to regulate diplomatic missions and frontier exchanges, while Mongol leaders seek access to goods, rewards, prestige, and favourable recognition. Restrictions, insults, economic pressure, and competing ambitions can sharpen tensions into war. In 1449, relations with Isan collapse into military crisis. The young Zhengtong emperor, influenced by the powerful court eunuch Wang Zhen and eager to respond decisively, personally leads an enormous Ming army northward. The campaign becomes one of the dynasty's most humiliating disasters. Poor logistics, uncertain command, exhausted troops, rain, shortages, and Mongol pressure turn the imperial expedition into a retreat. Near Tumu, not far beyond the defensive approaches to Beijing, the Ming army is surrounded and shattered. Vast numbers of soldiers die or are captured. Senior officials are killed. Most shocking of all, the emperor himself is taken prisoner. A ruler descended from conquerors who once led armies boldly into the north now becomes a captive of the very frontier power the campaign was meant to punish. The Tumu crisis does not end the Ming dynasty. Beijing holds under the determined leadership of officials including Yu Qian, who organizes its defense, rejects surrender, and places a new emperor on the throne while Isan's leverage begins to fade. The captured emperor is eventually returned, but the psychological wound is profound. A dynasty with its capital near the frontier has seen how quickly confidence can collapse into panic, and how little prestige can protect an emperor when military preparation fails. Tumu is often treated as the great turning point driving the Ming toward wall building, and it is certainly central. But the transformation is not immediate or simple. Defensive walls had existed before 1449, and offensive operations do not entirely cease afterward. Different officials continue to argue for different mixtures of cavalry, garrisons, diplomacy, trade regulation, punitive campaigns, and fortification. The wall cannot feed troops, train commanders, resolve court factionalism, or decide how to handle divided Mongol powers. Yet after Tumu, the appeal of permanent defences grows stronger. If Ming armies cannot reliably dominate the grasslands, then perhaps passes, walls, towers, and fortified lines can make raids more difficult, provide warning, concentrate defence, and keep catastrophic surprise farther from Beijing. The mid-15th century offers further reminders that the threat has not passed. Mongol groups continue to raid and bargain, sometimes pressuring for markets and tribute access, sometimes striking frontier zones whose inhabitants bear the immediate cost of policies formed in court. Later, under the powerful Altan Khan of the Tumid Mongols, the challenge becomes especially severe. Altan combines military pressure with a clear interest in trade and political recognition to Ming authorities. His demands pose both a practical and symbolic difficulty. Opening regulated markets may calm violence and supply needs, but it can also appear to reward armed pressure. Refusing can reinforce claims of dignity, while leaving frontier villages vulnerable to raids. The wall grows amid this unresolved argument, not as the opposite of diplomacy, but partly because diplomacy repeatedly fails, stalls, or remains politically dangerous. In 1550, Altan Khan demonstrates just how exposed the capital remains. His forces move through the frontier defences, exploit weaknesses around passes and routes north of Beijing, and raid the outskirts of the capital itself in the event known as the Gengshu Raid. Ming officials confront smoke, destruction, and terror almost within sight of the imperial centre. The attackers do not need to seize Beijing to make their point. They reveal the insufficiency of defences that exist only in fragments or are poorly commanded, poorly supplied, and vulnerable at their joins. After Tumu, the dynasty had learned that an emperor could be captured beyond the capital. After the raid of 1550, it learns that the capital can be humiliated without an imperial army ever marching far into the steppe. This is the atmosphere in which the most famous Great Wall begins to take its final form. Ming rulers and frontier commanders do not sit down with a blank map and design one wall from the Bohai Sea into the far west. Construction and rebuilding unfold over decades, unevenly, with resources concentrated where threat and political importance are greatest. Earlier earth walls are reinforced, strategic ridges are lined with masonry, passes are rebuilt, towers multiply. In some sectors near Beijing and through northern approaches, local stone cores receive strong brick facing and paved tops. Kilns fire huge numbers of bricks and tiles. Lime mortar binds courses into enduring faces. The architecture visible today is born not from the first emperor's sudden command, but from Ming insecurity refined through repeated military shocks. A brick wall in steep mountains is extraordinarily costly. Material must be quarried, fired, transported, hauled, shaped, and maintained. Soldiers and labourers work along exposed ridges in summer heat and winter cold. Roads and supply arrangements support the building. Officers inspect vulnerable points, argue about alignments, report damage, and plead for funds. Walls snake along heights not simply because the route looks dramatic, but because a crest offers visibility and makes attack harder. A force attempting to cross must climb toward defenders who can observe and signal from above. Towers provide shelter, communication, storage, and fighting platforms. Fortified passes turn natural corridors into defended gates. In the landscapes guarding Beijing, masonry expresses the urgent value assigned to the capital and the memory of how close failure has come. Still, even as the Ming creates its greatest fortifications, it never escapes the old contradiction. The empire needs trade with northern peoples, especially exchanges involving horses and goods. It needs intelligence, diplomacy, border markets, defectors, alliances, and flexible commanders. Altan Khan's raids do not end because every opening is permanently sealed. In 1571, peace and regulated trade arrangements bring a significant improvement in relations between the Ming and Altan sphere, demonstrating again that walls function best when political conditions allow them to function. Stone and brick may reduce vulnerability, but they cannot determine whether a rival leader prefers negotiation or attack, whether a court handles demands wisely, or whether troops at a pass remain disciplined when crisis arrives. The wall that rises during the Ming is therefore not a simple monument of strength. It is also the scar tissue of failed strategies, abandoned forward positions, court anxiety, frontier suffering, captured emperors, burned outskirts, and the dawning recognition that offensive glory no longer offers reliable security. Its towers stand above mountain ridges because open horizons have become frightening. Its bricks are laid thickly because older confidence has thinned. Yet to call it merely desperate would be unfair. The Ming Wall is a sophisticated military system, built by people responding rationally to real conditions, and in many places it succeeds in improving surveillance, controlling routes, deterring small raids, and supporting frontier defence. What it cannot do is restore the world the early Ming once imagined, when imperial armies rode north expecting the steppe to yield. By the late Ming, the ridges north of Beijing bear the unmistakable outline that future centuries will mistake for the whole Great Wall. Grey battlements ascend into cloud, towers command the valleys, and fortified gates guard the roads by which armies might approach the capital. Beneath their apparent permanence lies a long history of contraction. The Ming began with rulers looking far beyond the old walls, dreaming of commanding the northern world through attack and authority. It ends with its most enduring monument built closer to home, magnificent precisely because the danger has come so near. The stone dragon of the mountains is not the triumphant beginning of the Great Wall. It is the beautiful, formidable, and anxious answer of a dynasty that has learned what happens when the northern storm reaches the palace gate. The wall that rises above the mountain valleys north of Beijing does not defend by appearance alone. From a distance, its battlements seem almost theatrical, a line of grey stone arranged against peaks and cloud. Up close, the illusion gives way to machinery. The walkway is broad enough in places for soldiers, messengers, weapons, and supplies to move along the crest. Drainage outlets carry rainwater away before it weakens masonry. Parapets offer protection to defenders while crenellations open lines of fire. Towers are positioned not merely to beautify the skyline, but to observe approaches, shelter men, store equipment, relay alarms, and create defended strongpoints along vulnerable routes. The Ming Wall is famous because it is dramatic, but its real significance lies in the fact that it is not simply a wall. It is a military network spread across difficult terrain, designed to turn mountains, roads, valleys, passes, smoke, fire, labour, weapons, and information into a single system of resistance. The construction itself begins with geography. In the most heavily fortified northern sectors, especially those protecting approaches toward Beijing, the Ming do not attempt to make every kilometre identical. The line adjusts to the land, where steep bridges offer natural protection. Walls climb heights that already exhaust any force attempting to approach, where valleys open into routes large enough for troops, animals, carts, or raiding parties. The defences thicken around gates and fortresses. Where older earthworks survive from earlier regimes, they may be repaired, reinforced, replaced, or incorporated into new alignments. In western and less heavily resourced regions, packed earth remains common. in the strategically urgent mountain zones near the capital, masonry and fired brick become increasingly important. The famous image of the Great Wall is therefore the result of selective concentration, not proof that every frontier mile was built in the same way, but evidence that the Ming spent most heavily where failure could bring an enemy toward the imperial centre. To build in stone and brick across mountain ridges is to wage a campaign against the landscape before facing any enemy at all. Foundations must be prepared on slopes where footing is uncertain and transport punishing. Local stone can form the inner body or supporting base of a section, while shaped bricks create stronger, more regular outer faces and walkways. Lime mortar binds surfaces that must withstand frost, rain, wind, and the constant pounding of feet. Kilns near construction zones produce immense quantities of brick and tile. Quarries, carts, pack animals, human porters, military labour, craftsmen, and conscripted workers become part of the wall's hidden anatomy. A tower that appears lonely and silent on a ridge is the end product of supply chains descending through valleys and reaching back into administrative offices where grain, funds, labour quotas, tools, building schedules, and inspection reports are managed with frustrating imperfection. Some bricks preserve marks left by their makers or inspectors, traces of a practical system of responsibility. A unit, workshop, or place of production might be identified so defective material could be blamed on someone rather than disappearing anonymously into the mass of construction. This is one of the lesser-known aspects of the Ming Wall. Its endurance depends not only upon heroic labour, but upon bureaucracy. Bricks must meet standards, repairs must be ordered, troops must report collapsed sections, weakened towers, damaged gates, missing equipment, and shortages of food or fuel. A wall without accounts, inspections, punishments, and deliveries quickly becomes an impressive ruin in advance. The Great Masonry Barrier is as much a product of record-keeping and administrative pressure as of stone. The towers give the line its rhythm. Seen from a valley, they rise one after another, each apparently identical from a great distance, but their precise forms and uses vary according to sector, period, terrain, and military need. Some function primarily as watch positions or fighting platforms. Some provide rooms where soldiers can shelter from rain, snow, wind, and bitter northern winters. Some store weapons or supplies. Some guard particular slopes or routes. A tower interrupts the exposed walkway with solid refuge, a point from which defenders can concentrate fire, observe neighbouring positions, and endure an attack longer than they might on an open wall. On heavily defended Ming stretches, towers appear so frequently that the wall seems almost populated by architecture even when no people remain. In its working life, however, every tower implies men assigned to it, provisions carried to it, signals learned and practiced, weapons kept serviceable, and long empty days during which attention must not fail. The wall's visible line is only one layer of defence. Behind and ahead of it stand forts, garrison towns, barracks, supply depots, patrol routes, subsidiary walls, gates, trenches, and beacon towers positioned to extend awareness beyond the main rampart. A raiding force approaching a defended sector may first be noticed by scouts or an outlying watch station. Signals move towards stronger positions. Troops assemble at key passes. Gates close or prepare to admit civilians, livestock. Or patrols withdrawing under pressure. Messages are sent farther inward, warning regional commanders that the threat may require reinforcement. The true weapon of the wall is often time. Riders moving rapidly through open country thrive on surprise. A functioning signalling system steals part of that advantage, giving defenders minutes or hours that may separate a contained raid from a catastrophe. Smoke and fire are the most memorable signals because they translate danger into a visible chain across the landscape. A plume rising from one tower in daylight, a flame appearing against darkness, then another answering farther along the ridge, carries an almost irresistible dramatic power. Yet the system is more disciplined than a simple cinematic alarm. Ming frontier forces use combinations of smoke, fire, cannon shots, flags, and other signals according to local regulations and periods of reform, attempting to communicate the size or nature of an approaching force and the urgency of the response. Wolf dung is often mentioned in connection with frontier smoke because it was believed to produce a particularly straight or dense plume, though the practical use of signal fuel could include various available materials. Whatever burned, the purpose was not symbolism. It was communication under conditions where a mounted enemy could cover distance far faster than a messenger on foot. Gunpowder gives the Ming Wall another character absent from much earlier frontier construction. By the time its finest masonry structures are built and defended, gunpowder weapons are no novelty. Cannon, firearms, explosive devices, and signal guns form part of the military world the wall is designed to support. The battlements and towers are not relics of an age limited to bows and spears. Openings and platforms can accommodate a range of weapons. While fortified passes contain artillery positions capable of making a narrow approach dangerous, firearms do not render walls useless. In many contexts, they strengthen defended positions by allowing troops behind protection to project lethal force at attackers, but gunpowder also increases the demands of defence. Weapons require powder, ammunition, trained personnel, repair, dry storage, and effective command. An impressive tower lacking supplies is not a modern fortress. It's a stone lookout waiting to be bypassed or overwhelmed. Nowhere is the integration of architecture and strategy clearer than at the Great Passes. Zhuyongguan, northwest of Beijing, guards a crucial route through the mountains toward the capital and has been important in various forms across many centuries. Further west, passes such as the Jingguan form part of the wider defensive approaches. To the northeast, Shanhaiguan, where the mountains descend toward the Bohai Sea, becomes one of the most famous fortified gateways in Chinese history. Later celebrated as the first pass under heaven, it guards a corridor of enormous importance between northeastern lands and the approaches into northern China, far to the west. Jiayuguan stands at the edge of the Hexi corridor, a commanding fortress in an arid landscape where the Ming Wall reaches toward the memory of older routes and earlier frontier empires. These passes are not merely doors inserted into a continuous wall, they are controlled bottlenecks, administrative centres, military bases, customs points, and symbols of authority. Whoever controls a pass can supervise movement, collect information, regulate commerce, delay hostile forces, and decide, at least in theory, who is allowed to cross. The phrase "at least in theory" matters. A gate can be locked against a small party and still become vulnerable to corruption, betrayal, surprise, political confusion, or overwhelming force. A pass heavily fortified on paper can suffer from soldiers whose pay is delayed, officers who falsify reports, weapons neglected in storage, or commanders afraid to act without orders from above. Ming memorials and frontier reports preserve a world of continual concern, insufficient troops, damaged defences. Illicit trade, weak discipline, missing animals, inadequate grain, and officials proposing reforms while rivals criticise them. The finished wall appears calm because its problems are no longer moving. In life, it is filled with complaint and repair, the normal condition of any enormous system asked to perform under pressure for generations. The soldiers who defend the wall do not all arrive as temporary visitors. Ming frontier organisation relies substantially on hereditary military households, intended to provide soldiers generation after generation in exchange for land or state support connected with the military system. Garrison communities take shape near defensive zones. Families live in the shadow of service. Men cultivate fields when not on active duty, repair equipment, conduct patrols, carry supplies, and train with varying degrees of seriousness. In principle, such a system allows the dynasty to maintain permanent defensive populations without continuously recruiting new armies from the interior. In practice, land becomes insufficient, duties burdensome, households evade service, officers exploit subordinates, and military effectiveness varies sharply over time. The wall is manned by human beings caught inside institutions that decay, adapt, and occasionally revive under energetic leadership. Among the most important Ming commanders associated with strengthening the wall is Qi Jiguang, remembered especially for his earlier campaigns against coastal raiders, and later for his reforms on the northern frontier. In the late 16th century, serving in the northern defence region around Jizhou, east of Beijing, Qi supervises improvements to fortifications, training, organisation, and tower construction. Under his influence, numerous hollow enemy towers are built or upgraded. Designed to house troops and supplies more effectively than simple platforms, Qi understands that masonry alone is useless without disciplined men. His soldiers drill in coordinated tactics, use weapons suited to different circumstances, and operate within a defence intended to combine walls, towers, infantry, artillery, and rapid response. His work represents the wall at its most capable, not a desperate barrier built by panic, but a carefully managed military landscape under commanders who recognise both its potential and its limits. Those limits remain unavoidable. Mountain walls cannot cover every route equally. Extended frontier systems always contain weak points, poorly maintained sectors, gaps where difficult terrain is trusted more than masonry, and outlying positions that can be isolated. Even a watchtower that sees danger clearly cannot defeat it unless troops answer the signal. False alarms exhaust men, delayed alarms invite disaster. Smugglers and local traders know paths that formal maps may ignore. Raiders can probe a line repeatedly, learning where patrols are thin, where officials accept payment, or where weather makes response slow. Large armies may attack gates, seek help from defectors, or move through areas believed impassable. The wall raises the cost of movement, it does not abolish movement. Yet judged only by whether it prevents every incursion, the Ming Wall would be misunderstood as badly as when it is praised as invincible. Defences need not stop all violence to alter its scale and frequency. A well-guarded pass may deter attacks that are never recorded precisely because they are not attempted. A signal chain may allow villagers to bring animals inside protected zones before raiders arrive. A tower may hold long enough for reinforcements to gather. Fortifications may force an enemy to choose longer, harder, more predictable routes. In quieter periods, gates regulate markets and embassies, making exchange possible under watch rather than leaving every encounter to armed uncertainty. Scholars still debate how to measure the wall's military effectiveness across different sectors and decades, because the surviving record naturally preserves crises more vividly than ordinary days when a defensive system quietly performs its work. On a cold morning along a Ming ridge, the wall would not have seemed like a monument. Smoke from cooking fires might drift from a nearby garrison. Soldiers wrapped against the wind would look outward through haze, perhaps bored, perhaps anxious, perhaps concerned more immediately with rations or pay than with the fate of the dynasty. A messenger might hurry through a gate with an official document sealed against delay. Mules might strain upward carrying grain, powder, repair materials, or winter clothing. A brick loosened by frost might wait for men already short of labour. Somewhere far away, The emperor and his officials might discuss frontier policy in language of tribute, security, expenditure, and honour. Here on the wall, those decisions become physical: a filled granary or an empty one, a trained company or a scattered one, an alarm answered or ignored. This is the truth inside the Great Ming silhouette. The wall is not a magical line drawn against invasion, nor merely a useless symbol of fear. It is an immense working system, intelligent in its design, demanding in its maintenance, and entirely dependent on the quality of the society sustaining it. Its bricks preserve the urgency of a dynasty determined to defend vulnerable approaches. Its towers embody the hope that warning can overcome distance. Its gates acknowledge that no frontier survives by closure alone, and its soldiers, mostly invisible in the modern view, are the reason any of it matters. Stone can occupy a ridge for centuries, but only people can turn that stone into defence. Along the long frontier, their lives gather beneath the battlements, bringing the wall down from the realm of imperial strategy into the ordinary, exhausting, dangerous world of those who had to live beside it. The people who turn stone into defence rarely experience the wall as an object of wonder. To a soldier ordered onto a windswept tower in winter, it is a posting. To a farmer whose grain is assessed for nearby troops, it is a demand that returns with the harvest. To a merchant approaching a guarded gate with carts, animals, papers, and goods that officials might inspect, tax, delay, or confiscate, it is an obstacle and an opportunity at once. To a family living beneath a fortified ridge, the wall is neither an abstract symbol of empire nor a perfect barrier against danger. It is the horizon of ordinary life, the place from which alarms may come, the reason soldiers crowd the market, the structure that offers shelter in one season and brings officials asking for labour in another. Its towers dominate paintings and photographs because they are built to endure. The people around them remain harder to see, yet without their work, hunger, trade, compromise, fear, and persistence. The Great Wall would never have functioned for more than a brief and impressive moment. Along the Ming frontier, military service is meant to be rooted in households. Earlier rulers establish a hereditary military system in which designated families supply soldiers generation after generation. Supported in theory by land and provisions and organised through garrisons known as Wei and Suo, on paper, this offers the dynasty a permanent defensive population already placed where it is needed. Men grow grain when they are not drilling, patrolling, repairing walls, escorting supplies, or standing guard. Their sons inherit obligations. Their wives, parents, and children build lives in settlements tied to the rhythm of military duty. The frontier is therefore not simply lined with temporary barracks occupied by men passing through. It contains communities born from defence, communities whose family histories become bound to towers, passes, granaries, fields, and the uncertain arrival of state support. The system is efficient only when written in an official register. On the ground, life resists neat arrangement. Land assigned to military households may be poor, scarce, seized by powerful officers, or damaged by drought and warfare. Able-bodied men desert, pay others to substitute for them, seek better lives elsewhere, or remain listed in records even after their families can no longer provide service. Widows and elderly parents inherit the consequences of obligations once attached to men who have died or vanished. Commanders report shortages, local officials quarrel over responsibility, the court issues orders for reform, inspection, and discipline. Some units perform well under serious officers, others exist more convincingly in documents than on the wall itself. The empire may imagine a great defensive line manned by hereditary duty. But each tower depends upon whether real families possess enough grain, health, loyalty, and patience to keep sending someone upward into the wind. For the men actually stationed there, boredom can be almost as defining as battle. Most days on a functioning frontier are not scenes of arrows flying over battlements or cavalry gathering beneath a pass. They are days of watching. A guard peers across dry hills, narrow roads, winter scrub, distant grasslands, or drifting snow. He checks signal equipment, attends roll call, carries water, assists with repairs, drills with weapons, gathers fuel, tends animals, complains about supplies, listens for rumours, and tries to remain awake when nothing moves. The threat that gives his service meaning may appear only rarely, which makes vigilance harder rather than easier. A raid can be devastating precisely because weeks or months of stillness have taught men to expect another empty morning. The tower becomes a discipline of attention, its loneliness sharpened by the knowledge that one ignored plume of dust might become the event remembered by an entire district. Winter makes that isolation harsher. The celebrated wall climbing through green mountains in summer is only one face of the frontier. Snow gathers along battlements, wind enters through cracks and open embrasures, water freezes, roads become treacherous for animals carrying grain and fuel. Men stationed in high or exposed places endure cold that turns ordinary duty into punishment. In dry northern regions farther west, cold may be followed by dust, glare, thirst, and long distances between sources of supply. Clothing and shelter are therefore military necessities, not comforts. A hungry garrison without proper winter equipment becomes vulnerable before an enemy approaches. Reports of missing provisions or inadequate uniforms may sound trivial beside discussions of grand strategy, yet a wall held by shivering men who have not been paid or fed properly is already partly breached. The frontier soldier is not always merely a victim of the system. Service can provide status, income, connections, and access to markets or unofficial trade. Some officers build careers through effective defence, local influence, or family connections. Soldiers may cultivate land, keep animals, hire labour, engage in small commerce, or become embedded in local networks that make the frontier livable. Garrisons need blacksmiths, carpenters, brickmakers, cooks, stable workers, clerks, carters, healers, religious specialists, and merchants. Temples and shrines stand in some frontier settlements, offering protection and meaning in places where death and absence are familiar companions. Families arrange marriages, mark festivals, mourn the dead, borrow grain, share news, and watch children grow beneath walls built because distant rulers believe the world outside remains dangerous. Military life is never only military. A garrison that survives for generations becomes a town. With all the ordinary affection, rivalry, corruption, celebration, and exhaustion that towns contain. Beyond the towers lie farms whose relationship with the wall is complicated. Frontier defence requires food, and food requires land, water, seed, animals, tools, labour, and enough security for harvest to be gathered rather than burned or stolen. Military colonies and civilian communities near fortified zones grow grain to sustain troops and local populations. A successful defensive arrangement allows cultivation to spread in protected areas, stabilising both settlement and supply. Yet the same proximity to the wall can make farmers especially vulnerable. When raids occur, exposed households may lose animals first, because livestock can be driven away quickly. Crops may be trampled or destroyed. Villagers may flee toward fortified places, carrying children, food, household goods, or whatever can be gathered before danger arrives. A tower signal that gives warning may save lives, but it cannot guarantee a field survives until harvest. The distinction between soldier and farmer often blurs. Men expected to defend the wall may also be trying to coax grain from thin frontier soil. During planting or harvest, military duties compete directly with household survival. If commanders call men away at the wrong moment, families suffer. If men remain in fields when alarms demand service, defences weaken. Women and older family members may manage crops, animals, textiles, food storage, and household debts while male relatives serve. Patrol, transport materials, or never return from campaigns. Their labour rarely appears in grand narratives of fortification, yet it sustains the very population that allows a garrison system to exist. The wall is usually pictured as a masculine realm of soldiers and commanders, but its survival depends upon domestic work performed beyond the official gaze grinding grain, mending garments, preparing preserved food, caring for animals, maintaining households through absences, and finding ways to endure when promised support does not arrive. Markets gather these worlds together. Near important gates and frontier towns, trade can transform the atmosphere of defence. Horses, sheep, cattle, hides, wool, grain, cloth, metal goods, tools, tea and later frontier exchange, salt, and luxury articles pass through legal or semi-legal circuits. Mongol groups seek access to products not easily obtained from pastoral economies alone. Ming officials and military communities need horses, animals, information. And the reduction in raiding that stable commerce may provide. When authorised markets open, guarded hostility can temporarily give way to calculation. Animals are examined, prices argued, interpreters mediate, officials watch for weapons, fraud, disorder, or unauthorised contacts. Traders assess which regulations can be obeyed, bent, or avoided. A frontier market is never purely peaceful, because military pressure often shadows its negotiations. Yet it offers something no wall can offer by itself, a reason for people on both sides to prefer tomorrow's exchange to tonight's raid. Where regulation exists, smuggling is never far away. A government may restrict trade because it fears strengthening rivals or losing control of tribute and diplomacy. But soldiers underpaid at remote posts, merchants seeking profit, local communities needing goods, and northern buyers willing to pay do not automatically surrender their interest to imperial policy. Secret exchanges occur through lesser paths, bribed guards, nighttime meetings, falsified documents, or officials who condemn illegal commerce in reports while benefiting from it privately. Horses, metals, cloth, food, weapons, and intelligence can all move through unofficial networks. The smuggler occupies an uncomfortable place in the history of the wall. From the court's perspective, he weakens security. From the viewpoint of frontier life, he may also be one of the people ensuring that scarce goods keep moving when official arrangements fail. Scholars still debate the precise scale of unrecorded trade, because those most successful at evading authority leave the least convenient evidence behind. Even official trade creates anxieties. When peace arrangements expand markets, frontier officials may fear that Mongol visitors are learning routes, defences, troop conditions, and the weaknesses of garrisons. When markets close, those same officials may find themselves facing greater pressure from raids. The problem cannot be solved with purity. A completely sealed frontier is economically damaging and practically impossible. An open frontier may bring goods and peace while also producing opportunities for intelligence, corruption, and dependence. Those who live beside the wall understand this ambiguity more intimately than ministers in the capital. A farmer whose animals have been stolen may desire stronger military action. A trader whose livelihood depends on exchange may resent sudden closure. A soldier who receives goods or payment through informal trade may view a supposed enemy less simply than an official proclamation requires. There are also travellers whose presence does not fit neatly into war or commerce. Envoys move through gates bearing letters, seals, tribute, gifts, and carefully staged claims about status. Couriers carry urgent reports from threatened districts. Buddhist monks, local religious figures, craftsmen, interpreters, entertainers, fugitives, surrendered warriors, and families seeking safety can all appear within frontier society across different periods and places. Captives taken in raids may be carried away from homes, defectors may cross toward a new patron, surrendered groups may be settled inside defended zones, watched carefully while being used as soldiers, herders, intermediaries, or evidence of imperial power. The wall regulates belonging but never fully defines it. People cross not only because an army has opened a gap, but because human lives continually exceed the classifications officials assign them. At the fortified passes, the wall's human density becomes especially visible. A major pass is not simply an opening beneath an archway. It may contain administrative offices, barracks, granaries, temples, stables, workshops, inns or lodging places, markets, surrounding villages, and layers of walls designed to protect the route. Carts arrive with grain or building material. Horses are watered and inspected. Soldiers rotate duties. Merchants wait for permission to proceed. Officials record movement and argue over orders. Punishments are imposed for failure, desertion, contraband, or theft, though enforcement varies according to local influence and the willingness of powerful men to obey rules intended for others. News moves through such places with extraordinary speed: a new commander, a rumoured raid, a court dispute, a trade opening, an outbreak of disease, a bad harvest, an army approaching, a tax demand, an emperor's death. The pass is both barrier and funnel, concentrating the whole nervous life of the frontier into a guarded passageway. The greatest cruelty of wall life is that success often leaves little trace. When defenders repel a small incursion, when a signal permits families to escape danger, when a trade arrangement holds for another season, when soldiers pass an uneventful winter and return to their fields, history has little reason to remember. Records turn vivid when disaster breaks routine: a pass taken, a district looted, troops unpaid, commanders accused, settlements abandoned, people killed or carried away. This can make frontier existence appear as one continuous emergency. It was not. Children still played in settlements beneath towers. Families celebrated marriages and festivals. Farmers watched the weather more anxiously than they watched distant politics. Soldiers gambled, complained, borrowed, laughed, mourned, and hoped for easier assignments. Merchants found profit in dangerous places. People learned to build ordinary lives beside a monument constructed because ordinary life could be shattered. What survives in the record suggests that the wall's greatest human effect was not simply keeping one population apart from another. It created a society of the edge, a world in which defence and exchange, suspicion and dependence, state command and local improvisation remained entangled. The bricks above the mountain valleys were supported by grain harvested below them, by wives and children waiting in garrison homes, by animals trudging along supply roads, by clerks counting rations, by merchants bargaining at controlled markets, by labourers repairing storm damage, and by soldiers keeping watch through long hours when the frontier offered nothing but wind. Their daily existence gave the wall meaning. Their vulnerability would also reveal what happened when that meaning was tested by real violence, because a wall that protects lives can be judged only when danger reaches it, and men are forced to discover how much protection stone can actually provide. Danger rarely arrives at a frontier in the form most convenient for those assigned to defend it. It does not announce its route in advance or approach the strongest gate simply to test whether imperial construction has been worthwhile. It searches for livestock grazing too far from shelter, for valleys where patrols have thinned, for guards whose attention has softened, for winter conditions that isolate a tower, for a local official willing to ignore suspicious movement. For any point where stone is present but response is slow, the men living beside the Ming Wall understand this better than anyone in the capital. They know that the wall is not required to perform the impossible task later legend assigns to it, sealing the entire northern world away from every rider and every raid. Its real work is narrower and more practical. It is meant to detect danger sooner, restrict where danger can pass, protect vital corridors, force attackers into riskier choices, shelter troops and civilians, and turn surprise into a contest defenders may actually survive. Measured by those purposes, the Great Wall is neither an empty monument nor an invincible shield. It is a tool, and like any tool, its value becomes clearest not in grand claims, but in the difficult moments when people use it well. A raiding party seeking animals, grain, captives, or prestige usually benefits from speed. It wants to cross exposed ground before local forces gather, strike a vulnerable settlement, seize what can be driven or carried away, and withdraw before larger units intercept it. Against such attacks, a properly watched wall can be deeply inconvenient. It breaks open movement into routes that must be examined in advance. A low barrier may be crossed by determined riders, especially where the wall is damaged or lightly manned. But crossing with horses and captured livestock is far slower and more dangerous than sweeping freely across unprotected plains. A fortified gate cannot simply be ignored when it controls the easiest path through steep mountains. A watchtower that sees riders before they descend toward villages gives nearby communities time to drive animals inward, shut gates, flee to protected places, or alert military units. Even when a raid is not stopped at the barrier itself, it may be stripped of the suddenness on which its success depends. This matters because much frontier violence is not conducted by enormous armies attempting to conquer the dynasty. It is smaller, repeated, opportunistic, and ruinous to those who suffer it. A village does not need an invading host of tens of thousands to experience catastrophe. A swift attack that takes its cattle, burns its stores, kills several people, and carries others away can damage a community for years. Grain may be replanted, animals, labour, confidence, and family members are harder to restore. If wall defences reduce the frequency of such attacks in a defended sector, if they cause raiders to turn elsewhere, if an alarm saves even part of a harvest or a herd, then the wall is performing a function that grand histories often overlook. The absence of disaster is difficult to record. A household that survives because riders choose not to attack a guarded approach leaves no dramatic entry in a chronicle. Yet much of effective defence consists precisely of dangers discouraged, delayed, or diverted before they become memorable. At mountain passes, the wall's power becomes far more direct. Northern approaches toward Beijing are shaped by terrain that can turn movement into vulnerability. A large cavalry force thrives where it can spread, manoeuvre, feed horses, scout widely, and choose the pace of engagement. In a restricted pass, those advantages diminish. Steep slopes, narrow roads, layered gates, towers, walls, and defenders positioned above the route make passage costly. The obstacle does not need to be absolutely impossible to matter. An attacker must decide whether the gate is worth storming, whether another route offers easier movement, whether supplies can endure delay, whether surprise has already been lost, and whether defenders farther south are gathering while the force remains trapped before a fortified throat. Such decisions shape campaigns. They can transform what might have been a rapid strike into a dangerous operation requiring preparation and risk. Zhuyongguan illustrates why certain places are fortified repeatedly over many centuries. The route it commands through the mountains northwest of Beijing is important, not because one dynasty decided to make it famous, but because geography keeps returning military attention to the same opening. A defended passage there can help shield the capital from forces approaching through a natural corridor. Its walls, gates, towers, and associated defences do not guarantee that every enemy remains outside, but they demand that an enemy solve a problem before advancing. Similar logic operates in other passes and corridors. At Chanhaiguan, between mountain and sea, the line controls one of the crucial approaches from the northeast into the northern plain. Farther west, forts and gates protect roads through arid regions where water, supplies, and routes already constrain movement. The wall becomes most convincing where it cooperates with the land, using cliffs, ridges, deserts, rivers, and narrow corridors as partners in defence rather than pretending masonry alone can master open space. Signals extend that defensive partnership across distance. A watchman does not have to defeat an approaching force with his own weapons to be useful. He has to see it, understand enough of what he sees, and transmit warning before the enemy reaches softer targets. Beacon fires, smoke, cannon reports, flags, and relayed messages form a nervous system across the frontier. The great advantage of mounted raiders is that they can move more quickly than scattered rural communities can organise. A signal chain challenges that advantage by moving information ahead of them. The alarm passes from tower to tower while riders still cross exposed terrain, and suddenly an intended victim is no longer entirely unaware. Gates can close, animals can be withdrawn, reinforcements can prepare at a pass. A local commander can send urgent word toward a stronger garrison. The enemy may continue forward, but now into a landscape beginning to harden against it. The speed and reliability of such signals varied greatly, and no surviving regulation proves flawless performance in every crisis. Fog, storms, night conditions, negligent guards, confusion over signal codes, corruption, fear, or deliberate deception could all disrupt warning. Scholars still debate how consistently particular signalling arrangements were used across different Ming sectors and periods, because official rules do not always reveal daily practice, yet the logic is undeniable. And in well-managed regions, the system could be formidable. The most surprising measure of the wall's effectiveness may not be the height of its battlements at all, but the distance over which an approaching threat could become known before it arrived. A wall that communicates is far more dangerous to an attacker than a taller wall whose towers stand silent. The presence of gunpowder weapons strengthens this effect. A raiding force meeting a tower or pass defended by firearms and artillery does not confront only men sheltering behind stone. It faces concentrated fire from protected positions, with narrow approaches making evasive movement more difficult. Cannon used for signalling can also contribute to defence. Firearms on walls and in fortifications allow small numbers of trained defenders to make an assault costly, particularly where terrain funnels attackers into exposed ground. In a full-scale campaign, artillery does not guarantee safety, and well-organised enemies can bring their own weapons, siege skills, intelligence, or alternative routes. But for many frontier encounters, the combination of wall, tower, elevation, warning, and gunpowder changes the calculation sharply. Raiders seeking profit do not benefit from losing men and horses before they have taken anything. A protected, alert district is less attractive than one where animals graze unwatched and soldiers arrive after the damage is done. The wall also gives defenders places from which to operate offensively. Its image as a passive shield can obscure the fact that garrisons do not simply wait behind battlements. Patrols move outward to observe routes, escort travellers, investigate suspicious signs, intercept small forces, retrieve animals, guard markets, or gather intelligence. Fortified positions offer bases for cavalry and infantry, able to strike from comparative security. When alarm is raised, local troops may pursue raiders during withdrawal, especially if the attackers have slowed themselves by taking captives or livestock. Supply depots, fortified towns, and protected roads help keep military units ready for such action. A frontier system functioning well does not merely resist crossing, it threatens consequences for those who cross at the wrong place or remain too long after a raid. This is why the walls are often linked with negotiations and markets rather than replacing them. Once a fortified line provides some control over routes and gatherings, officials may feel more capable of permitting regulated exchange at selected points. Markets held under watch are safer for the dynasty than completely uncontrolled movement, and safer for traders than a frontier in which every encounter risks becoming theft or conflict. The wall can therefore help shape peaceful contact as well as violence. Gates concentrate exchange where officials can monitor it, where military forces are nearby, and where agreements can be enforced more credibly than in open country. A successful trade arrangement reduces the desire for raids. A credible defence makes trade less easily turned into coercion. In such moments, the wall is not merely an architecture of refusal, it's part of a system attempting to replace unpredictable conflict with supervised passage. The famous settlement with Altan Khan in 1571 shows the value of combining defence with political accommodation. For years, Altan's military pressure had exposed weaknesses in Ming border policy and brought devastating raids, including the humiliation near Beijing in 1550. Wall building and strengthened defences matter in this period, but so does the recognition that military barriers alone cannot remove the economic and political forces driving conflict. When the Ming court and Altan reach arrangements involving titles and trade, frontier violence is reduced significantly in important regions. Peace does not arise because the wall has become unnecessary, nor because negotiations prove that defensive works were foolish. Rather, each supports the other. A fortified frontier gives the Ming greater ability to regulate contact and resist pressure. Markets and diplomacy reduce the number of moments when fortifications must bear the entire burden of policy. The strongest wall is one standing in a political landscape where fewer people need to test it. There are many less famous encounters in which defenders appear to use walls effectively. Ming frontier records contain reports of raids detected, approaches contested, small groups driven off, enemy casualties inflicted near fortified points, and commanders rewarded or criticised according to their performance. These episodes rarely become central legends because they do not culminate in the capture of an emperor or the fall of a dynasty, yet they are closer to the daily purpose of the system. A force approaching a defended sector may be fired upon from towers, find gates securely held, lose the chance to seize livestock, and withdraw before a larger engagement occurs. In the arithmetic of frontier survival, that is not a minor outcome, it is the desired one. Fortifications are built less to generate glorious victories than to make disastrous encounters less common. The wall can also impose a psychological order upon a dangerous region. For villagers and garrison families, towers visible on the ridge announce that someone is watching, that there are places of refuge, that a signal may come before riders appear at the edge of the fields. Such reassurance is never complete, especially when defences fail or officials neglect their obligations, but it can support settlement in exposed regions that might otherwise be abandoned. For soldiers, a strong tower or fortified pass offers protection impossible in open pursuit across grassland. For the court, the wall creates defensible positions around which manpower and resources can be organised. For an approaching enemy, it presents uncertainty. Are the towers manned? Has the force been seen? Are reinforcements already moving? Is a seemingly weak route actually watched from behind walls, work partly by altering what people dare to attempt? Yet even here the measure of success must remain honest. If a defended line turns raiders toward a more weakly protected district, the protected sector's safety may be another community's suffering. If expensive construction absorbs resources needed for cavalry, supplies, intelligence, or relief for hungry soldiers, local effectiveness may conceal broader vulnerability. If trade peace reduces raids for decades, officials may allow military readiness to deteriorate precisely because quiet makes danger seem distant again. The wall's strengths are real, but they remain conditional. They depend upon maintenance, troops, signals, leadership, provisions, political judgment, and an enemy whose goals do not exceed what local defence can frustrate. On most days, this conditional success is all the frontier asks. A beacon remains unlit because no raid approaches. A market closes peacefully at sunset. A shepherd brings animals back through a guarded route. A soldier finishes a watch without hearing alarm cannon. A family harvests grain in fields lying beneath a ridge lined with brick towers. The wall has not conquered the north or removed fear from the landscape. It has created enough warning, enough obstacle, enough controlled passage, and enough confidence for life to continue. That is what the wall could stop, not history itself. Not every army, not the collapse of every dynasty, but countless smaller disasters whose prevention allowed frontier communities to survive one more season. The trouble is that dynasties are not always destroyed by the kind of danger a wall is built to meet. A barrier can slow riders crossing from outside. It cannot easily defend against an empty treasury, a hungry army, a divided court, an ambitious general, a gate opened from within, or a state whose political foundations have already begun to crack. The very structure that performs well against ordinary frontier violence can appear suddenly powerless when danger does not arrive as a raid to be signalled from a tower, but as a crisis already spreading through the empire behind it. The danger that destroys the Ming does not first appear as a distant plume of dust beyond the towers. It rises from fields, villages, tax offices, military camps, court factions, silver markets, flood-stricken districts, unpaid garrisons, and the exhausted interior of the empire itself. Along the northern ridges, The wall still stands in enormous strength. Towers still overlook the passes, gates still possess cannon, barracks, officers, signal equipment, and the memory of centuries of alarm. Some sectors are among the most formidable frontier defences the world has seen. Yet a defensive system designed to slow movement from outside cannot repair a government coming apart behind it. In the final decades of the Ming Dynasty, the Great Wall does not fail because stone has suddenly become worthless. It fails because stone can magnify human organisation, but it cannot replace it. By the early 17th century, the Ming faced pressures from nearly every direction. The court is fractured by bitter political struggles, with officials, eunuch factions, reformers, critics, and regional interests accusing one another while urgent problems multiply. The military consumes immense resources but often struggles to receive them where needed. The tax system is strained, particularly by reliance on payments increasingly linked to silver at a time when shifts in silver availability and economic disruption deepen hardship in many regions. Cold conditions associated with the later phases of the Little Ice Age contribute to difficult harvests in parts of the empire, while drought, famine, floods, locusts, and epidemic disease compound suffering unevenly across the landscape. None of these forces alone explains collapse. Scholars still debate their relative weight and the ways local disasters connected to national crisis. Together, however, they create a world in which millions of people are asked to endure more precisely when the state has less ability to help them. This matters on the frontier because fortifications are expensive even when already built. Walls require repair after storms, frost, erosion, and neglect. Towers require soldiers. Soldiers require grain, pay, clothing, powder, ammunition, horses, officers, and some belief that service is not an empty sacrifice. A strong masonry line may remain visually imposing while the institution sustaining it thin from within. Late Ming officials continually confront the difficulty of financing armies across northern defences at the same time that rebellions, court expenditure, local distress, and new military threats draw resources elsewhere. Delayed pay is not merely an administrative inconvenience. Soldiers who have not been fed or rewarded may desert, loot nearby communities, sell equipment, disregard orders, or attach their loyalty to commanders rather than to a distant dynasty. A tower garrison whose families are starving is still physically present on the wall, but the moral contract required for defence has begun to collapse. The greatest new external challenge rises in the northeast, not from exactly the same Mongol threat against which so much Ming wall building had been directed. Beyond the fortified corridors and Ming-controlled zones of Liaodong, the Jurchen leader Nuhasi gathers power in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Jurchens have a long history in the northeast. Centuries earlier, Jurchen rulers had founded the Jin dynasty and built frontier walls of their own. Now, under Nuhasi, separate groups are drawn into a formidable military and political organisation structured through the banner system. At first, Nuhasi's relationship with the Ming includes recognition and interaction within the existing frontier order. Gradually, rivalry, grievances, opportunity, and his increasing strength overturn that relationship. In 1616 he declares a new Jin state, later called the Later Jin, and in 1618 openly announces grievances against the Ming before moving into war. The conflict exposes how little an impressive wall can achieve when the threatened frontier is a vast political military zone rather than one continuous defended rampart. The northeast contains cities, forts, passes, alliances, military colonies, local commanders, and peoples whose loyalties matter immensely. Nuhasi's forces seize key positions and defeat Ming armies in the field, most dramatically at the Battle of Sahu in 1619, where Ming forces and their allies are destroyed in a campaign whose failures include divided command, difficult terrain, and an opponent able to concentrate force effectively. The Ming have artillery and fortified places. They do not lack material resources in an absolute sense. What they lack repeatedly is reliable strategic coordination equal to a rising power whose leadership is coherent and whose momentum draws further strength. Some Ming commanders nevertheless hold with striking effectiveness. Yuan Chonghuan, defending the vital northeastern line, uses fortified cities and cannon to stop Nuhasi at Ningyuan in 1626, a rare and important Ming victory in a period of growing danger. Nuhasi dies later that year, possibly after illness associated in tradition with wounds from the battle, though the exact cause is not certain. Under his successor, Hong Taiji, however, the later Jin recover and adapt. They improve their own use of artillery, strengthen administration, draw defectors and conquered populations into their cause, and eventually rename their dynasty Qing. This is one of the wall's harsh lessons: any defensive advantage exists in time, not eternity. Technologies can be copied, routes can be studied, fortresses can be isolated, men who know the defender's weaknesses can change sides. The Ming court's handling of its best commanders further reveals the threat within. Yuan Chonghuan, despite his defensive successes, becomes entangled in suspicion and political crisis after Qing forces bypass major defended positions and raid toward Beijing in 1629. Accused of betrayal amid panic and court intrigue, he is executed in 1630 on the orders of the Yongzhen emperor. The dynasty destroys an experienced commander at the moment it most needs capable leadership. His fate is not the sole reason for later defeat, but it symbolises a government increasingly unable to distinguish danger from the people trying to resist it. A wall cannot compensate for a command system in which fear travels inward faster than trusted information. Nor can the Ming focus entirely on the northeastern threat. because behind the wall the countryside is generating armies of desperation. In the 1620s and 1630s, famine, tax burdens, military dislocation, and government weakness feed rebellions, especially in the northwest. Men who begin as hungry fugitives, deserters, bandits, or displaced peasants gather into forces capable of taking cities and challenging imperial authority. Among their leaders, Li Zicheng rises to become the most famous. Once connected with the postal service before joining rebellion, he builds a movement that promises relief from burdens and attracts people who see little reason to remain loyal to officials unable to protect or feed them. Rebel violence can itself be devastating, and communities may suffer whichever force passes through, yet the spread of rebellion makes a crucial reality impossible to conceal. The empire is being attacked not only across its frontier, but from within the social wounds its own failures have opened. By 1644, the Chongzhen Emperor presides over a state caught between converging crises. Qing power threatens from the northeast. Li Zicheng advances from the interior. The treasury is depleted, command is divided, relief is inadequate, officials disagree, delay, conceal, and plead. The wall still dominates the northern mountains, and the Great Pass of Shanhaigun remains a powerful fortified gateway between the northeast and the approaches to Beijing. Its commander, Wu Sangui, controls troops whose decision will become central to the dynasty's final tragedy. But the decisive blow initially does not come through Shanhaiguan. It comes from the rebel advance into the capital's world. In April 1644, Li Zicheng's forces enter Beijing. Resistance fails with astonishing speed. The Chongzhen Emperor, abandoned by the machinery of an imperial order that can no longer protect him, kills members of his household and hangs himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City. The wall has not been stormed in a final grand assault that destroys the Ming. The emperor dies because the capital falls to rebels from within his own realm. This alone should end any belief that the Great Wall could serve as a simple measure of whether a dynasty was secure. An empire can possess gigantic defences against the northern horizon, while losing the roads behind its capital, the faith of its soldiers, the obedience of its subjects, and the capacity to answer hunger before hunger becomes revolt. Li Zicheng now claims authority in Beijing, but his own hold on power is unstable. Wu Sangui stands at Shanhaiguan, confronted with a choice among collapsing loyalties and immediate dangers. The Ming emperor is dead. Rebel forces approach. Beyond the pass waits the Qing regent Dogon with a formidable army. The story often becomes simplified into one dramatic gesture. Wu Sangui opens the gates of the Great Wall to the Manchus, and China falls because the wall is betrayed. The reality is more complex. Shanhaiguan is indeed crucial, and Wu Sangui does ally with Qing forces against Li Zicheng. Whether imagined motives involving a concubine played a decisive role belongs largely to later romantic legend. Political and military desperation offer more credible explanations. Wu's forces face the rebel regime that has taken the capital and threatens his position and family. The Qing offer military partnership under conditions that ultimately serve their own conquest. In late May 1644, at or near Shanhaigun, Wu Sangui and Qing armies defeat Li Zicheng's force in battle. The Qing then advance toward Beijing. They do not simply raid and withdraw. They take possession of the centre of empire and present themselves as restorers of order, while proceeding to establish their own rule. This moment carries an irony so complete that it almost feels invented. The most celebrated Ming Pass, defended within the Great Wall system intended to contain northern threats, becomes the point through which a northern-founded dynasty enters China proper not by smashing useless defences, but by exploiting civil war and being admitted into a shifting alliance. The masonry does not collapse. The gate operates exactly as gates always have. It allows passage when those holding it decide that passage serves survival. A wall can obstruct an enemy. It cannot define which army becomes an enemy when the state it was built to defend no longer commands loyalty or agreement. Even after entering Beijing, the Qing do not instantly possess the entire Ming realm. Conquest takes decades and involves ferocious resistance, shifting allegiances, massacres, local struggles, surviving Ming claimants, rebellions, and enormous human suffering. The Great Wall does not announce one sudden end to Chinese history. It marks a turning point in a long and brutal reordering. The Qing themselves are Manchus, descendants of the Yurchen world that had developed beyond and across older frontier structures, yet as rulers of China they inherit the wall along with everything else. Their power eventually reaches deep into Mongolia and Central Asia, changing the strategic context so greatly that the Ming masonry loses much of its former role as a defensive edge. Like the Yuan before them, the Qing governed territories on both sides of the line a previous dynasty had feared, the wall remains, magnificent and increasingly obsolete as an imperial frontier system, because history has once again moved through it rather than being stopped by it. It would be easy to treat 1644 as proof that the wall never worked. That would be as misleading as claiming it made the Ming safe. For decades, and in many regions, fortifications delayed raids, protected passes, supported trade regulation, and gave frontier communities precious warning. Strong defenders at Ningyuan and elsewhere showed that masonry combined with artillery and leadership could halt even a rising power, but a wall cannot choose a competent court. It cannot raise silver from an exhausted economy without consequence. It cannot bring rain to drought-stricken fields, cure disease, prevent officers from defecting, persuade unpaid soldiers to remain loyal, or stop a rebel army advancing through the heartland it was never positioned to defend. It cannot save a dynasty that needs rescue from every direction at once. Standing at Shanhaiguan after the smoke of 1644 has cleared, the gate would still appear mighty, Mountains remain on one side, sea near the other, walls enclosing a corridor shaped for control. Yet the meaning of the place has been overturned. Behind it lies a dead Ming emperor and a seized capital. Beyond it comes an army that will become the new imperial order. The past has not betrayed its purpose. Human beings have used it according to the desperate possibilities left to them. That is what the wall could not stop, not simply an invading force, but the collapse of certainty itself. When hunger turns subjects into rebels, when commanders no longer know whom they serve, when enemies become allies and allies become conquerors, stone can do nothing but stand while the world it was built to protect passes into someone else's hands. By the time the Qing banners enter Beijing and the Ming Wall begins to lose the military purpose that had shaped its most famous towers, the Great Wall has already become more than a frontier system. It has become a vessel for memory. The dynasties that ordered its construction are judged through it. The labourers who vanished into remote works are mourned through it. Defeat, loneliness, separation, endurance, imperial cruelty, national survival. And the longing to believe that something so immense must have an equally immense meaning all gather on its ridges. Once a monument enters that realm, facts do not disappear, but they begin to share space with stories far easier to remember. A wall running across deserts and mountains for thousands of miles seems to demand marvels. People begin to say it is the only human structure visible from the moon, that millions died building it, that their bodies lie entombed inside it, that one emperor created it in a single savage act, that it stopped invasion until treachery undid it. Some of these claims contain echoes of real suffering or real scale. Others are modern inventions. The truth is not smaller than the myths. It is simply less convenient, because it requires the wall to be seen not as a single miracle or a single crime, but as the accumulated work and grief of many centuries. The most famous modern myth is also among the easiest to test the claim that the Great Wall can be seen from the moon, or that it is uniquely visible from outer space with the unaided eye. The belief became widespread long before humans travelled into space, appearing in modern writing when the wall's vast length inspired speculation from people who had never seen the Earth from above. It sounds plausible because length is easy to imagine, and width is easy to forget. From the ground. The wall seems immense. From the moon, it's a thin structure made mostly from materials close in colour to the mountains, soil, and desert around it. Astronauts have repeatedly explained that the Great Wall is extraordinarily difficult to distinguish from low Earth orbit under normal conditions without magnification, and certainly not visible as a unique human-made line from the moon. Cities, airports, large roads, fields, bridges, dams, and illuminated urban regions may be more readily apparent from orbit than a narrow earth-toned wall following natural ridges. The myth persists because it offers cosmic confirmation of grandeur. It imagines the wall not merely impressing visitors, but announcing humanity itself to the heavens. Yet the real achievement does not require an observer on the moon. It is enough that people without modern machines raised and maintained defences across environments where merely surviving a posting could demand more courage than any legend can express. Another myth binds the wall to one name, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. In the public imagination, he often appears as the man who commanded the Great Wall into existence, driving innumerable labourers across northern mountains to build the same brick fortifications later seen near Beijing. The truth is more layered. Qin's reign is essential to the wall story because his government connects, repairs, and extends earlier northern defences after unification, transforming walls once belonging to separate states into part of an imperial frontier system. His rule is also associated with forced labour, military mobilisation, and harsh burdens that later generations remembered with anger. But the brick and stone walls now most famous were built largely under the Ming, more than 15 centuries later. Before Qin, rival states had already constructed long walls. After Qin, Han, Northern Wei, Northern Qi, Sui, Jin, Ming, and other regimes built or maintained frontier defences according to their own dangers. The Great Wall has no single builder because the problem it represents returned too many times. The first emperor became its most powerful human symbol, not because every brick belongs to him, but because his reign made the wall into a story about the cost of imperial ambition. That cost leads to the darkest and most emotionally powerful legend that labourers who died building the Great Wall were buried inside it. Their bones mixed into its core until the entire monument became a tomb. It is not difficult to understand why such a belief survives. The wall passes through remote, dangerous landscapes. Building it demanded brutal effort. Qin labour service and military projects could separate people from their homes under severe conditions. Later dynasties also compelled labourers and soldiers to work far from their families in cold, dry, exposed regions where disease, hunger, injury, violence, and exhaustion could kill. There is every reason to believe that human beings died in connection with wall building and frontier service across its long history, but the claim that bodies were routinely entombed within the wall itself is not supported by archaeological evidence. Human remains placed inside construction material would have weakened tamped earthwork and masonry rather than strengthening it. Where burial grounds or human remains are associated with labour populations and frontier zones, they do not prove that corpses were used as mortar or deliberately sealed inside ramparts. The distinction matters, not because the suffering was slight, but because suffering should not need a fabricated method of burial in order to be taken seriously. A labourer does not have to become part of the wall's material fabric for the wall to have consumed his life. He may have died of illness in a work camp, collapsed during transport, frozen during a northern winter, succumbed to hunger at a poorly supplied garrison, been killed during attack, or simply disappeared from the household that waited for him. His body may have been buried beside a root, in a frontier cemetery, or in a grave now lost entirely. The absence of bodies inside the bricks does not cleanse the monument of death. It only replaces a dramatic image with a harder truth. Much of the human cost of empire leaves no monumental trace at all. This is why the legend of Meng Jiangnu remains so important. In its most familiar form, her husband is taken to labour on the Great Wall soon after their marriage. She travels a vast distance to bring him warm clothing, only to discover that he is dead. Her grief is so great that her weeping causes part of the wall to collapse, revealing his bones. The story is not a factual account of Qin construction. Its earliest surviving roots concern a grieving widow in a different setting. And only across generations does the tale become attached to the Great Wall and the first emperor. As it changes, it becomes more than a personal tragedy. It turns imperial construction into something that can be judged by a single woman's sorrow. Armies, walls, titles, conquests, and state decrees appear suddenly fragile before grief that refuses to remain hidden. The wall collapses in the legend because memory insists that the lies beneath imperial achievement cannot remain invisible forever. Legends of this kind often preserve moral truth while altering historical detail. Qin really did become a lasting emblem of coercive power. Wall building really did demand labour and military service from people who rarely chose their assignments. Families really were divided by state commands. Frontier conditions really could be lethal. But a historian must separate those realities from later storytelling, not in order to strip the past of emotion, but to understand where the emotion came from. The story of Meng Jiangnu survives because official monuments naturally celebrate command while ordinary memory remembers absence. Her journey gives a face to the unrecorded cost of walls, roads, palaces, tombs, canals, wars, and all the works through which rulers attempt to make themselves appear larger than time. There are other simplifications equally powerful because they seem to explain the wall at a glance. One is the idea that it was built solely to keep Mongols out. Mongol powers were certainly central to the Ming Wall's finest surviving fortifications, and Mongol raids, negotiations, wars, and political relationships shaped the dynasty's northern strategy. But the wall story begins centuries before the Mongol Empire. Early walls defended rival states from one another. Qin and Han defences confronted northern confederations including the Xiongnu. Northern Wei rulers built against the Rouran. Northern Qi and Sui defences faced Turk pressures. Jin walls confronted powers in the north, before the Mongol conquest transformed the entire political world. Even within the Ming period, not every threat or function can be reduced to one word. The wall guards trade routes, passes, fields, capitals, garrisons, political claims, communication lines, and regulated markets. To say it was built against the Mongols is to describe one major layer while mistaking it for the whole landscape. Another myth is that the wall completely failed because invaders crossed it. That argument treats fortification as successful only if it changes history forever. By that standard, almost every city wall, fortress, naval defence, and border system ever built is a failure, because no political order lasts indefinitely. The Great Wall never made invasion impossible. No responsible commander could have believed that an unending line of stone or earth would permanently seal every mountain track. Desert route, negotiated gate, corrupt outpost, or politically confused pass. Its practical functions were more limited and often more successful, raising warning, slowing raids, protecting corridors, defending strategic gates, controlling travel, supporting troops, and shaping diplomacy. When the Ming collapsed, it was not because every defensive work had always been useless. It was because no frontier barrier could remedy rebellion in the capital's hinterland, fiscal exhaustion. Military mistrust, famine, factionalism, and a commander at Shanaigun choosing Qing alliance amid a dying political order. The opposite myth, however, is just as distorting the Great Wall as an absolute shield, proof that China had always sought isolation behind an impenetrable northern edge. Nothing in the wall's long history supports so simple a picture. Gates existed because movement was expected and necessary. Markets opened because exchange mattered. Envoys, horses, goods, military intelligence, settlers, surrendered groups, defectors, labourers, religious influences. And technologies moved through the frontier world. Dynasties expanded beyond walls when strong and retreated behind them when vulnerable. Regimes founded by peoples from north of earlier defences later built walls of their own. Under Yuan and Qing authority, rulers governed broad territories across old lines, reducing the wall's strategic centrality because the political geography had changed. Far from proving timeless isolation, the wall testifies to endless contact, conflict, borrowing, negotiation, and dependence. Even its appearance misleads. Visitors encounter restored brick stairways, crenellated parapets, solid towers, and mountain ridges arranged into an unforgettable silhouette. They may reasonably imagine that this is what the whole wall has always looked like. Yet much of the wall through history was made of rammed earth, local stone, gravel, brush, reeds, and compacted layers adapted to regional material and need. Some of its oldest and most historically revealing remains are low, damaged, and visually modest. The celebrated brick surface is a late and selective face, especially associated with Ming defence in strategic sectors. Modern restoration adds another layer, preserving sites for tourism and heritage, while sometimes smoothing away the rawness of ruins. The wall seen today is genuine, but it is not a transparent window onto every century of construction. It is the most durable and most carefully remembered part of a much broader, more fragile inheritance. There is no shame in being drawn first by legend. Myths attach themselves to structures that exceed ordinary understanding. A wall this vast invites stories as a mountain invites clouds. The mistake is not feeling their power, but allowing them to replace the evidence entirely. The Great Wall does not need to be visible from the moon to be extraordinary. It does not need skeletons sealed in every rampart to bear witness to human suffering. It does not need one emperor as sole creator, one enemy as sole purpose, or one moment of betrayal as sole explanation for its limits. Its truth is more haunting because it refuses simplicity. It is made from repeated fear, repeated calculation, repeated labour, repeated failure, repeated survival, and repeated acts of remembrance by people who looked at broken lines across the landscape and tried to explain what those lines had cost. By the time the wall becomes a monument of legend, many of its older stretches are already losing their form. The great brick sectors continue to draw the eye, but farther from restored passes and imperial roads, earthen ramparts soften into the same ground from which they were raised, towers crumble into solitary shapes, desert winds expose layers of reed and gravel, then begin erasing them again. The myths remain easy to carry from one generation to another, because stories travel lightly. The physical evidence is more vulnerable. To meet the Great Wall beyond its legends means following it away from its grandest stone face, into the quieter places where history is not carved in triumph, but fading almost silently back into the earth. Move away from the repaired battlements outside Beijing, away from the watchtowers whose brick silhouettes have become instantly recognizable across the world, and the Great Wall begins to lose its familiar shape. The stairs vanish first, the crenellations disappear, the masonry gives way to rough stone, then packed soil, and stretches so low and weathered that the eye can pass over them without understanding what it has seen. In the far northwest, under a sky larger than any structure, the wall no longer appears to command the landscape. It seems almost to surrender to it a pale raised line across gravel, a wind-cut ridge of earth, a broken tower standing in isolation beside dry ground and thorny vegetation. Yet these fading remains are not minor echoes of the true monument. They are among its most ancient, extensive, and revealing forms. The famous wall survives because brick and restoration have protected parts of it. The quieter wall of earth and reeds is disappearing because it was always made from the vulnerable substance of the frontier itself. Across northern and northwestern China, the availability of local materials shaped construction more decisively than any desire for uniform appearance. Mountains near strategic Ming sectors offered stone and justified enormous expenditure on fired brick, mortar, towers, and fortified passes. Farther into dry grasslands, lowest regions, gravel plains, and desert margins, builders worked with earth. They tamped local soil between frames, layer upon compacted layer, creating walls strong enough for the demands of their time, in particularly arid regions of Gansu and beyond, where the Han frontier once extended toward oasis roads and the approaches to Central Asia. They alternated compacted gravel and earth with bundles of reeds, tamarisk branches, brushwood, or other plant material. These organic layers helped bind the structure, much as practical builders everywhere learned to make strength from what the landscape yields. The result was not beautiful in the later architectural sense, but functional, resourceful, and astonishingly resilient under dry conditions. At some ruined Han sections near Dunhuang and the Jade Gate, the ancient method remains visible in cross-section. The wall has been cut and worn by time until its inner structure lies exposed narrow dark layers of reeds or brush, between thicker beds of compressed soil and gravel. The plants are brittle now, dry as old paper, yet in places they have survived nearly 2,000 years. Such remains can be more startling than monumental brick. The hand of construction feels suddenly close. Someone gathered those reeds from wetlands or river-fed ground in a desert-edge environment. Someone bundled them, laid them down, covered them with earth, pounded the next course into position, and then continued under sun, wind, orders, exhaustion, and the urgent demand that a frontier line must stand. An emperor's name may hover over the project in the historical record, but the wall itself preserves the material selected by people who knew precisely what the local earth could and could not do. Dryness has been the great preserver of these western remains. In regions with little rainfall, earth walls may stand for centuries after maintenance ends, their surfaces slowly roughened by wind rather than washed away by frequent storms. Wooden documents, reeds, textiles, straw, and other organic materials can survive in archaeological contexts that would destroy them almost immediately elsewhere. That is why the deserts of the northwest have preserved not merely walls and beacon towers, but the small written remains of frontier administration wooden slips, accounts, orders, records of travellers and supplies, fragments of a world once connected by lonely posts. Yet the same desert that preserves also erodes. Wind strips away loosened surfaces, sand abrades exposed faces. Sudden rain can cut deep scars into walls built for a climate where water was scarce, but never entirely absent. Preservation is not safety. It is only a slower kind of loss. Elsewhere, earthwork defences face even greater threats from ordinary weather. A wall made of tamped earth can resist astonishingly well while maintained, especially where its compacted layers remain protected and dry, but abandoned for centuries in areas of rainfall, freeze and thaw, plant growth, grazing, agriculture, and settlement. It gradually softens into an embankment, then into a rise almost indistinguishable from natural ground. Brick walls announce themselves. Earthen walls can vanish in plain sight. A farmer may plough near or through a line whose original purpose has been forgotten locally. A road may cut across it. Villagers in past centuries may remove useful materials from nearby towers or fortifications, not out of hostility toward heritage, but because old construction lying unused can become a ready supply for new homes, pens, paths, or fields. The wall, once built by extracting effort from local communities, can later be quietly returned to local life piece by piece. This is one reason the total surviving Great Wall system is so difficult to imagine. Maps can display lines extending across thousands of kilometres, but a line on paper does not show the difference between a restored Ming rampart filled with visitors and an eroded Han barrier that survives as a slight ridge under desert light. Nor does it reveal sections known from historical records but no longer securely located on the ground. Sections disturbed by modern development. Branches raised in different eras for different purposes, or natural features incorporated into defence. Surveying the Great Wall has therefore required more than following obvious masonry. Researchers use historical documents, local knowledge, field exploration, aerial and satellite imagery, archaeological excavation, remote sensing, and careful comparison of landscape traces. Even so, uncertainty remains. Some earthworks are difficult to date precisely. Some claimed wall segments need cautious evaluation. Some lines may represent military boundaries, trenches, roads, settlement works, or defences with functions altered across time. The evidence remains incomplete because the most ancient wall is also the easiest to erase. The far west holds an especially haunting version of that erasure. Jiayuguan, the great Ming fortress at the western end of the most famous Ming wall system, rises dramatically near the edge of the Hexi corridor, its towers and enclosed walls forming a powerful image of departure and imperial reach. Later travellers and imagination often treat it as a last gate before an empty wilderness, the place where exiles and soldiers looked back toward the world they feared they might never see again. But the broader frontier history continues west beyond the Ming fortress, through Older Han remains toward Dunhuang and the Jade Gate. There the landscape opens into hard distances, pale desert flats, gravel, eroded towers, wind, and mountains on horizons that seem almost unreachable. It is possible to stand near a crumbling defensive line and understand immediately why the wall could never have been only a physical barrier. In country this immense, the wall is a thread. Its importance lay in the human chain it once supported watchers, horses, supplies, signals, wells, stations, documents, guides, troops, and travellers attempting to cross spaces in which one failed calculation could kill. A surviving beacon tower in the desert can seem lonelier than any mountain battlement. The Ming Wall near Beijing is visually connected, tower following tower along ridges, its line persuading the mind of continuity. In the western wastes, a tower may stand separate from anything obviously recognisable as a wall, rising from flatness like a remnant of a forgotten language. In its working age, it belonged to a sequence. Smoke or fire from one station had meaning because another could observe it. And another beyond that could carry the alarm onward. Once the neighbouring positions crumble, the tower becomes almost incomprehensible in isolation, a solid shape guarding emptiness. But emptiness is an illusion created by time. Around it once moved all the uncertainty of frontier life patrols looking for tracks, messengers carrying sealed slips, merchants and envoys searching for the next oasis, labourers hauling fuel, soldiers calculating water and distance, commanders trying to read dangers approaching through glare and dust. These desert sections also reveal the wall's relationship with water. No garrison survives simply because a ruler has chosen an impressive line on a map. Stations must relate to springs, rivers, wells, irrigable land, oases, or supply routes capable of keeping people and animals alive. Along the western corridors, control of water is inseparable from control of movement. Travellers follow routes shaped by where they can drink and resupply. Armies face the same constraint on a greater scale. A fort near an oasis may matter more than a longer wall in waterless ground. A watchtower can warn of hostile movement, but it cannot make a thirsty patrol function where no supplies arrive. The old Han system extended into the desert not by conquering dryness, but by locating fragile points of support within it. Where those points failed, imperial power thinned rapidly into aspiration. The survival of reeds within ruined walls gives another glimpse of a past environment easily overlooked. The northwest is arid, but it has never been uniformly barren. Rivers descending from mountains, oasis wetlands, marshy patches, cultivated zones, and seasonal water sources supplied plant material and supported communities along corridors of movement. Bundles of reed pressed into a defensive wall are therefore not only engineering material, they are environmental evidence. Reminders of local resources used by frontier builders and of landscapes that may have shifted through climate, irrigation, abandonment, and modern pressure. The Great Wall does not stand apart from environmental history, it records it. Stone reveals geology, tamped earth reflects local soils, reed layers preserve plant life and water access, erosion reveals rainfall and wind, abandoned garrisons mark places where sustaining human presence once became strategically worthwhile. They're no longer possible or no longer needed. Today, these remains confront dangers their builders never imagined. Some are damaged by natural erosion intensified through time, others suffer from construction, roads, industrial development, mining, agriculture, tourist pressure, off-road vehicles, and deliberate removal or vandalism. In remote places, protection is difficult because the very length and fragmentation of the Great Wall make constant monitoring impossible. Not every crumbling earthen ridge can be roofed, reconstructed, or guarded. Restoration presents its own dilemma. A decaying wall may need stabilization if it is to survive, yet excessive rebuilding can replace ancient material and texture with a modern imitation of what people expect a wall to look like. For brick sections, insensitive restoration has sometimes been criticized for smoothing historic ruins into neat, lifeless surfaces. For earth sections, the challenge is even more delicate: preserve too little, and the wall returns to dust. Intervene too aggressively, and the faint original structure is concealed beneath a new one. Recognition has grown that the less spectacular wall demands protection precisely because it is easy to neglect. The Great Wall was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Property in 1987, acknowledging its exceptional scale, historical significance, and architectural meaning. Yet official designation cannot suspend weather or solve every local threat. Surveys conducted across China have revealed immense numbers of wall-related remains, as well as severe deterioration in many areas. Public attention still concentrates naturally on accessible scenic sections, especially those near Beijing, while earthen ruins far from major visitor routes remain much harder to make visible in cultural memory. The wall that sells the image of national endurance is generally made of brick. The wall most at risk of quiet disappearance is often made of dust-coloured earth, and when it is gone, many visitors may never realise what part of the story has vanished with it. There is a temptation to believe that ruins should look ruined, that erosion gives the wall romance, and that preserving every fading mound interferes with the passage of time. But the earth walls are not merely picturesque traces. They are evidence. Their construction methods reveal technologies suited to particular environments. Their roots reveal strategic priorities different from those of later dynasties. Their associated documents illuminate the bureaucratic and human life of garrisons. Their materials hold information about plants, soils, water, and labour. Their disappearance does not simply soften a view. It closes questions future researchers may otherwise be able to ask. Preservation is therefore not an attempt to deny time. It is an effort to keep time from silencing the record before it can be understood. And yet, standing before a Han Wall in the Western Desert, it is impossible not to feel the force of its gradual return to the landscape. The structure was born from earth and reeds. Unlike the heroic brick rampart of modern expectation, it never pretends to be independent of its surroundings. Its colour belongs to the ground. Its broken edges release the same gravel and dust from which it was shaped. In late light, it can appear briefly vivid, a long shadow exposing the exact direction of a barrier invisible at noon. Then the sun shifts, and the wall fades again, absorbed by the plain. The effect is almost cruel in its beauty. Empires commanded men to make a line permanent across this emptiness. For centuries, the line held long enough to carry signals, defend stations, mark ambition, and leave its trace. Now it survives at the mercy of the same wind that once raised alarm dust on the horizon. The most vulnerable portions of the Great Wall offer no convenient myth of invincibility. They cannot be admired without recognising loss. Their towers do not march triumphantly over green peaks. They crumble in silence beneath a sky, indifferent to the names of dynasties. Yet they may bring the observer closer to the truth than any perfect battlement. The Great Wall has always been less permanent than it wished to appear. It was built, repaired, abandoned, overtaken, repurposed, remembered, and eroded because every frontier order is temporary. Soon, others would take these broken lines and turn them into something different. Once again, not merely abandoned defences, but a monument of heritage, identity, tourism, restoration, and modern memory. Before that transformation, the old earth wall leaves one quiet warning in the desert. Even the greatest structure can vanish without falling, grain by grain, into the landscape it once attempted to command. Remains of past burdens, frontier sorrow, imperial defence, separation from distant lands, or proof that even works intended to outlast generations eventually surrender to grass and dust. In earlier literature, frontier walls had long carried emotions of exile, military hardship, and distance from home. Under the Qing and into the modern age, those older associations remained, but they gradually became joined by new interpretations. The wall could be treated as a relic of dynasties already past, an object to be measured by foreign visitors, a symbol of a country being described and judged from outside, and eventually an image through which modern China would imagine its own continuity. Foreign travellers and observers contributed strongly to the wall's global fame. European accounts of China, especially from the early modern period onward, often approached the wall with astonishment, even when descriptions relied partly on reports rather than direct inspection. To distant audiences, its scale seemed almost beyond belief. It entered maps, travel literature, geographical writings, missionary reports, engravings, and later photography as one of the supreme wonders of the human-built world. But admiration often came with misunderstanding. Many outsiders assumed the wall represented an ancient, unchanging desire to shut China away from the rest of humanity. They imagined it as a single creation of remote antiquity, rather than a layered frontier system with gates, markets, military settlements, diplomatic crossings, and sections raised by many different regimes. A monument already simplified in Chinese popular memory became further simplified as it travelled abroad. It was no longer just the long wall of a complex frontier past, It became the Wall of China, an enormous visual shorthand for an entire civilization. That shorthand gained new force in the 19th century, when Qing China faced increasing pressure from foreign empires, unequal treaties, internal rebellions, military defeats, economic disturbance, and arguments over reform and survival. The old wall offered little answer to modern gunboats, industrial armies, global finance, or powers arriving by sea rather than descending through northern passes. Its military irrelevance could now feel painfully clear. A structure raised against older threats could not shield the empire from the conditions of a new age, yet precisely because it no longer served effectively as defence, it became available as symbol. The wall could evoke endurance at a moment of humiliation. It could also suggest failure in an immense inherited past that had not prevented weakness in the present. Different observers saw different meanings in the same ridges. To some foreigners, the wall reinforced stereotypes of isolation and stagnation. To Chinese reformers and intellectuals confronting national crisis, it could become part of the difficult question of what should be preserved from the past and what must change if the country were to survive. When the Qing dynasty fell in 1911 and China entered the turbulent Republican era, the Great Wall was drawn further into modern national imagination. The old imperial frontier no longer belonged to a reigning emperor. It could be recast as the inheritance of a people and a nation struggling to define itself amid warlord conflict, foreign intrusion, political division, and competing visions of modernity. The idea of a shared national history was enormously powerful in a country whose territory and sovereignty appeared under threat. The wall, reaching across landscapes and linking remembered centuries, offered a physical image of endurance. It was not necessary for every historical interpretation attached to it to be precise. Symbols rarely wait for complete archaeological caution. What mattered was that the wall could be seen, photographed, visited, sung about, and imagined as a surviving spine of collective memory. Its symbolic power intensified under the threat of Japanese expansion. In the early 1930s, fighting reached the Great Wall region after Japan's seizure of Manchuria and the establishment of Manchukuo. In 1933, Chinese and Japanese forces fought in campaigns around Great Wall passes, including fierce engagements at places such as Jifanku and Gubeku. Soldiers defended old stone positions in a conflict shaped by modern rifles, artillery, machine guns, aircraft, and the geopolitics of a 20th century invasion. The wall could not by itself reverse the military imbalance or halt the larger advance, but images and reports of Chinese troops resisting at its battlements transformed the monument again. Ancient fortifications became a stage for modern national defence. Men fought on walls built in earlier centuries against an invader arriving within an entirely new political world, and the connection between old stone and present survival acquired emotional force. Around this period, the phrase that the Chinese people had reached their most dangerous hour entered one of the most enduring modern patriotic songs, the future national anthem of the People's Republic of China. Its call to build a new Great Wall from human bodies did not mean literally returning to Ming-style construction. It made the wall a metaphor for collective resistance, a defence no longer built only from brick or tamped earth, but from people united against invasion. The transformation is profound. For imperial courts, the wall had represented authority imposed across the frontier. For modern national memory, it increasingly represented a people standing together against dismemberment and foreign occupation. The monument once associated with conscription and imperial burden could now be invoked as a shared symbol of sacrifice and survival. After the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Great Wall's symbolic role continued to expand. It belonged to a past that could be interpreted through labour, resistance, unity, technological accomplishment, national territory, and historical continuity. It also became a site of preservation and public display. Sections close to Beijing, especially Badaling, were restored and prepared to receive large numbers of visitors. Roads improved access. Photographs of dignitaries walking its battlements reinforced the wall's status as a required encounter with Chinese history. International visitors came to see it not as an active military work, but as a monumental emblem of China itself. The wall entered posters, textbooks, films, postage stamps, official ceremonies, documentaries, advertising, and the private albums of travellers from across the world. Tourism saves and transforms at the same time. Without restoration, maintenance, legal protection, and public value, some famous stretches of the wall might have deteriorated far more severely or been dismantled for materials. Restoration allows people to walk where defenders once stood, to see how towers relate to ridges, to feel the steepness of a route, and to grasp physically the effort required to build across mountains. The wall's continued visibility depends partly on this care. Yet tourism also encourages a selective view. The cleanly rebuilt battlements at popular sections become, for millions of visitors, the Great Wall in its entirety. Crowds move across strong paving and through complete towers, often unaware that elsewhere older lines of earth are dissolving into the desert, or that even nearby unrestored Ming sections can be unstable, broken, and overgrown. A structure preserved for understanding can unintentionally narrow understanding if its repaired face replaces the far more complicated whole. Restoration itself invites difficult judgments. A wall is not protected simply by making it look complete. Some 20th and 21st century repairs have stabilised vulnerable sites carefully, respecting original materials and preserving evidence of construction. Others have been criticised for using excessive cement, flattening historically textured surfaces, replacing ruined complexity with smooth new walkways. or reshaping fragments into versions more suited to quick viewing than careful history? This debate contains no easy answer. Allow a ruined sector to collapse entirely, and unique evidence is lost. Reconstruct too freely, and the visitor encounters a modern creation placed where a ruin once told a subtler truth. Preservation requires restraint, documentation, technical knowledge, and acceptance that not every damaged wall should be made to appear whole again. A ruin can communicate age, vulnerability, and abandonment in ways a perfect parapet cannot. The scale of the challenge is immense. The wall is not one protected monument within one fenced archaeological park. It crosses provinces, climates, populated districts, mountains, deserts, farming zones, roads, industrial regions, and remote areas where routine monitoring is difficult. Some portions are threatened by rainfall, sandstorms, earthquakes, plant roots, and ordinary erosion. Others are damaged when bricks are removed, paths are widened, unauthorized building occurs. Vehicles cross vulnerable ground, development cuts through remains, or visitors climb areas unable to bear constant pressure. Local communities may live beside wall fragments that outsiders recognize as heritage, but which also occupy land needed for everyday life. Protecting the Great Wall therefore requires not only national pride, but practical cooperation with the people whose villages, farms, and roads share the same landscape. Since its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Property in 1987, the wall has received heightened international recognition and growing attention to conservation. Surveys have expanded awareness of how many walls, trenches, towers, passes, and related sites survive from different periods. The very discovery of greater extent has made the story richer and the responsibility heavier. To preserve the wall means preserving Qin and Han earthen frontier traces, as well as Ming brick towers, desert signalling stations, as well as scenic mountain walks, unglamorous ridges whose significance may be visible only to trained eyes, as well as dramatic passes appearing in every travel guide. It also means accepting that parts have already been lost, and that further loss cannot be prevented everywhere equally. Heritage, like defence, requires choices about where resources go and what can still be saved. Meanwhile, the modern wall lives a second life far beyond its physical stones. It is used in the language of unity, resilience, achievement, and cultural pride. It appears in international diplomacy, sporting imagery, educational material, brand identity, and the visual presentation of China to the world. People hike it for adventure, photograph engagements upon it, visit it as part of family memory, or travel across oceans to experience a place they have known since childhood as one of the world's great wonders. These uses are not false merely because they are modern. Monuments always accumulate meanings their builders could never have predicted. A Ming officer worrying about loose bricks and insufficient powder could not have imagined tourists lifting phones above his tower. Nor could a Han guard in the desert have imagined his crumbling reed wall becoming protected heritage for a global public. Their wall has outlived its orders and now belongs to memory. Still, modern symbolism carries risks of its own. When the wall is asked to stand for a seamless, timeless national identity, its more complicated history can fade from view. The frontier it marked was not always the edge of one stable nation. Some walls were built by rival states before unification. Some were built by regimes founded by peoples once situated beyond earlier walls. Some defended expansion rather than merely resisting it. Some facilitated markets, envoys, migration, and cultural contact. Some failed because the state behind them failed first. Remembering this does not weaken the wall as heritage. It makes that heritage more honest. The wall can symbolize endurance without pretending history was simple. It can inspire pride without erasing those who suffered in its construction, or those who lived on both sides of its shifting lines. As evening gathers over a restored Ming section, visitors begin to descend, their voices fading down the stone stairways toward roads, buses, stalls, and the modern city beyond the mountains. The wall remains high on the ridge, beautifully lit for a time by the sinking sun. It looks complete from this angle, almost untouched by the centuries. But elsewhere, at the same hour, an earthen Han line is becoming indistinguishable from a desert plain. A northern key ridge has lost another small amount of soil to rain. An abandoned tower stands above farmland where nobody is keeping watch. A village wall incorporates bricks taken long ago from an imperial defence already obsolete when they were reused. The Great Wall survives not in one condition, but in many celebrated, neglected, repaired, damaged, studied, marketed, remembered, and slowly disappearing. Its final transformation is therefore not from wall to monument, as though one identity simply replaces another. It is from a frontier system built to manage uncertain movement into a vast historical surface, upon which later generations project their own uncertainties. Empires feared riders on the horizon, modern societies fear forgetting, distortion, loss, fragmentation, and the disappearance of physical links to a past too large to hold in words alone. The old towers can no longer send alarms that decide the safety of capitals. Their signal now is quieter. They ask what the living will choose to remember: a fantasy of one perfect wall, a monument of effortless grandeur, or the far more powerful truth of a structure built and rebuilt by vulnerable people across vulnerable landscapes for worlds that never remain secure for long. The wall has been asked to carry many meanings. It has been called a shield against invasion, a tomb for labourers, a monument to cruelty, a triumph of engineering, a symbol of isolation, a line of national endurance, a failure overcome by enemies, and a wonder so vast that legend tried to lift it beyond the earth itself. Each interpretation touches some part of the structure, some period of its life, some emotion that generations have placed upon its stones and earthen ridges. But none of them alone is large enough. The truth of the Great Wall does not stand at one restored pass, belong to one emperor, or answer one question about whether a barrier succeeded or failed. Its truth is scattered across the landscape in low warring states' ramparts raised against rival kingdoms, in Qin earthworks tied to conquest and coercion, in hand-reed-layered defences stretching toward desert roads, in the walls built by northern dynasties whose rulers crossed every simple division between insider and outsider, in Ming bricks shaped by artillery, anxiety, trade, and humiliation, in Qing conquest that passed through a frontier already collapsing politically from within, and in the modern monument preserved, visited, marketed, argued over, and still slowly eroding. The wall is not a single statement. It is an archive of repeated attempts to hold uncertainty in place. Its beginnings make this clear. Before there is a unified imperial China, rulers build long barriers against other states within the same contested world. Those early walls do not declare the existence of an eternal cultural boundary. They declare fear of neighbouring armies, fear of losing grain lands and passes, fear of becoming the next kingdom absorbed by a stronger rival. When Qin unifies the realm, old internal defences lose their original purpose while selected northern lines become part of a new imperial problem. Qin Shi Huang's frontier works are enormous, costly, and later remembered through the bitterness of forced labour, yet they do not create from nothing the brick wall seen in modern photographs. They reorganise older answers to an older anxiety. Then the Han extend defences farther west, not to withdraw from the wider world but to enter it more deeply, guarding corridors through which armies, horses, envoys, merchants, information, and new ambitions all travel together. That alone overturns one of the wall's most persistent misunderstandings. The Great Wall is not simply the architecture of a civilization refusing contact. It exists because contact is constant and difficult to control. Walls rise where movement matters along routes of trade, invasion, migration, diplomacy, livestock exchange, taxation, military supply, and imperial expansion. Gates are not accidental weaknesses in a perfect barrier. They are essential parts of the system. Because a frontier must let certain people and goods through, even while attempting to stop others. The same pass may receive an embassy in one year, supervise a market in another, shelter frightened civilians during a raid, and become the scene of betrayal or conquest decades later. The wall is less a locked door than a vast effort to decide who may cross, under what terms, carrying what goods, serving which authority, and with what risk. Even the peoples supposedly separated by the wall repeatedly defy neat categories. Northern powers are not faceless waves outside history. They are societies with leaders, families, economies, alliances, rivalries, diplomatic strategies, and cultures adapted to environments where mobility is often essential. Chinese dynasties do not merely defend, they attack, occupy, settle, bargain, recruit, purchase horses, reward defectors, open markets, close markets, and sometimes expand far beyond previous defensive lines. Regimes founded by Xianbei, Khitan, Yurshan, Mongol, and Manchu ruling houses become central participants in the history of northern China, and some build walls against threats farther beyond their own frontiers. A barrier later imagined as marking an absolute divide is repeatedly constructed by rulers whose very existence proves that the divide never remained absolute for long. The wall's materials reveal the same complexity. Its most celebrated face is made of Ming brick and stone, rising across mountains close enough to Beijing to be preserved, restored, visited, and photographed. Those battlements are real and extraordinary, the product of a dynasty that invested heavily in defending approaches to its exposed capital, after centuries of changing relations with Mongol powers, and after humiliations that made the danger impossible to dismiss. But most of the Great Wall's story cannot be told in brick alone. Earlier lines were formed from rammed earth, gravel, reeds, brushwood, local stone, trenches, and fortified stations. In dry western regions, fragile organic material survives within collapsed walls as evidence of builders working with the resources available to them. In wetter zones, ancient earthworks have softened nearly back into the ground. The wall has never been uniformly monumental. Often its grandest historical meaning survives in forms so modest that a traveller might mistake them for natural ridges. Its builders are equally easy to lose beneath the scale of the achievement. Emperors issued commands, generals led campaigns, officials submitted memorials and counted provisions. But the wall existed because countless unnamed people dug earth, pounded layers into firmness, fired bricks, quarried stone, carried lime, transported grain, tended animals, stood guard, repaired collapse, lit alarms, cultivated garrison fields, processed documents, traded at gates, raised children in exposed settlements, mourned relatives sent away, and learned to make ordinary life beside structures built for the expectation of danger. Some died, some deserted, some profited, some served unwillingly, some found status and livelihood within frontier communities. Their experience cannot be compressed into one legend, even one as moving as the story of Meng Jiangnu. Yet the legend understands something that official architecture tries to hide. Every monumental defence is also a record of people whose private losses rarely receive stone inscriptions of their own. To say this is not to dismiss the wall's military purpose. The Great Wall could work. It could make small raids harder and more dangerous. It could force movement toward guarded routes. It could protect passes, shelter troops, warn villages, regulate markets, secure supplies, delay enemies, and provide the time required for defenders to respond. Under capable commanders, well-supplied garrisons, functioning signal systems, and political conditions favouring stability. It could help preserve frontier life through decades in which open exposure would have been far worse. A wall does not need to defeat every future army to have mattered to the shepherd, whose animals were brought inside before a raid, the village whose warning arrived in time, or the soldier who faced attackers from a protected tower rather than in an undefended field. But the wall could not perform miracles, and the dynasties behind it repeatedly discovered the difference between defence and salvation. It could not prevent every crossing across thousands of kilometres of changing terrain. It could not guarantee honest officials, disciplined troops, adequate supplies, or wise policy. It could not eliminate the need for markets, alliances, diplomacy, intelligence, and military mobility. It could not stop famine, political faction, rebellion, fiscal crisis, disease, ambitious commanders, or a court destroying its own capable servants. Most dramatically, it could not save the Ming in 1644, because the disaster did not arrive as a simple invasion pressing against a sealed northern line. The dynasty was already failing from within when Li Zicheng entered Beijing and the Chongzhen emperor died. At Shanhai Guan, the wall did not crumble beneath an irresistible assault. Its gate became part of a desperate political decision through which Wu Sangui and Qing forces turned civil collapse into dynastic conquest. The event does not prove that fortifications were useless. It proves that no fortification can preserve a state whose loyalties and institutions are breaking apart behind it. Nor did history end when the wall ceased to perform its former military role. Under Qing rule, the frontier expanded beyond the old Ming line, leaving many battlements as relics of a strategic geography already transformed. Slowly, the wall moved from active defence into memory. Foreign travellers marvelled at it and often misunderstood it. Modern reformers, nationalists, artists, soldiers, governments, preservationists, and tourists gave it new meanings. During the 20th century, as China faced invasion and national crisis, the Great Wall could be invoked not as an old imperial barrier but as a symbol of shared resistance. Later, restored sections became places where visitors from around the world encountered Chinese history through one unforgettable image. Yet every modern use adds another layer of interpretation, another possibility that the wall may become cleaner, simpler, and more complete in memory than it ever was in the past. The deepest truth is that the Great Wall never represented security achieved. It represented security pursued. Every dynasty that built or rebuilt it recognized some form of exposure of vulnerable route. A contested field, a threatening confederation, a weakening strategy, an endangered capital, an empire extending beyond what it could comfortably hold. The wall is impressive not because it solved those problems permanently, but because human beings continued trying to solve them, even while history showed that all solutions would eventually be temporary. It is a structure of fear, but not fear alone. It is also a structure of organisation, adaptation, endurance, ambition, calculation, contact, and memory. It speaks of rulers seeking control, soldiers seeking survival, communities seeking protection, merchants seeking passage, enemies seeking advantage, and later generations seeking a meaning large enough to match what remains. Seen this way, the Great Wall ceases to be a line dividing civilization from emptiness. It becomes a meeting place, though often a violent one, between ways of living, governing, moving, trading, fighting, and imagining the world. It records how agricultural empires struggled with mobile military powers, but also how both sides needed exchange. It records how conquerors could become rulers and then build walls against the next danger. It records how a border may be defended fiercely while remaining culturally and economically permeable. It records how landscapes themselves participate in history, mountains directing roads toward passes, deserts preserving reeds inside walls, drought sharpening vulnerability, rivers supporting settlements and supply routes, wind slowly undoing what labour once forced into form. There is no single point from which the whole wall can be understood. From Battling, it is masonry flowing over green ridges, restored and crowded, magnificent in the way only a structure both ancient and immediately physical can be. From Shanhai Guan, it is a gate haunted by political collapse and the arrival of a new dynasty. From Jieyu Guan, it is the edge of remembered imperial reach, facing dry horizons and old roads west, near Dunhuang and the Jade Gate. It is a vulnerable earthen line built from reeds and gravel, almost disappearing into the desert while preserving a world older than the most famous brick towers. In ruined northern earthworks, it is proof that regimes now forgotten once feared the same open distances. In every place, the wall is different because history used it differently. Perhaps that is why it continues to compel attention. Its popular image is simple enough to recognise instantly, yet its real story refuses to become simple, no matter how closely it is studied. The more of the wall that comes into view, the less it resembles one triumphant monument, and the more it resembles human civilization itself built in layers, shaped by danger, revised after failure, dependent on forgotten labour, filled with exchanges that official stories prefer to overlook, and never as permanent as it appears in the moment of greatest confidence. The wall does not prove that isolation works, that invasion can always be prevented, or that political power can make its boundaries eternal. It proves something quieter, and perhaps more enduring people confronted by uncertainty will reshape entire landscapes in the hope of protecting what they know, even when the horizon will eventually bring changes no wall can hold back. Late in the day, on a distant stretch where no crowd climbs and no restored battlement catches the camera, the wall is barely visible. It runs across the earth as a long, fading interruption, lower than the hills, quieter than the wind. Once, men stood there because someone in a capital believed that line mattered. They watched dust, counted signals, guarded stores, waited through cold nights, feared approaching riders, missed homes far away, and carried out orders belonging to dynasties that seemed, in their own time, impossible to erase. The dynasties are gone. The alarms have ended. The markets at guarded gates have changed or disappeared. The frontier has moved, expanded, dissolved, and been remembered in forms those centuries could never have predicted. Still the line remains, sometimes in stone, sometimes in brick, sometimes only as compressed earth catching the sunset from a certain angle. It does not speak of victory alone, or failure alone. It speaks of the long human wish to make danger visible, to raise something solid against uncertainty, to believe that enough labour and enough vigilance can give fragile lives a measure of safety. For a while, sometimes, they can. Fields are harvested, children grow, travellers pass. Fires remain unlit because no alarm is needed. Then time changes the meaning of every defence. Gates open for new rulers, towers empty, earth softens. A structure once crowded with urgency becomes silent enough for later people to walk upon it and wonder what it truly was. And perhaps the wall's silence is the most truthful part of all. It does not insist upon the myths built around it. It does not claim to be one wall, built once, against one enemy, for one unbroken purpose. It lies across mountain and desert with all its contradictions, exposed barrier and road, defence and burden, monument and ruin, national symbol and evidence of a frontier world far more mixed than memory often allows. It has endured not as proof that empires can defeat time, but as a reminder that even their greatest efforts eventually become questions left for others to answer. The sun lowers behind the ridges. For a brief moment, the battlements glow, and an earthen trace far in the west casts a shadow longer than itself. Then the light thins. Stone, reed, dust, tower, mountain, and road settle into the same darkening landscape. The wall no longer needs to guard the horizon. It has become part of it.